Close your eyes. Take a slow, quiet breath in and let it drift gently out. Tonight, we're going somewhere vast, somewhere ancient and open and impossibly wide. We're going to a place where the sky is everything, where it stretches in every direction without interruption, from horizon to horizon, from east to west, from the pale edge of dawn all the way around to the deep indigo of a night that has no end. A sky so enormous and so filled with stars that the darkness itself feels warm, feels close, feels like it is breathing alongside you. We are going to the Mongolian steppe, and it is night. Picture it now, gently, softly. The land beneath you is flat and immeasurable, covered in a sea of short, tough grass that whispers in the evening breeze. There are no mountains here, not yet, not in this part of the great central plain. Only the earth, rolling gently like the surface of a quiet ocean, and above it, the sky, immense and silver-dusted with stars that have been watching this land for thousands of years. The Milky Way is a river of pale light overhead, so bright out here, far from any city, that it casts the faintest shadow on the ground. The grass bends and stirs. The horses breathe. Somewhere nearby, a fire flickers. It is small, a careful fire, the kind made by people who know wind, who understand that fuel must be respected, who have learned over countless generations how to coax warmth from dried dung and bone-dry scrub on a treeless plain. The flames glow orange and gold, and around them the shapes of felt tents, round, low, sturdy against the elements, stand like patient dark hills in the darkness. These are zhurs, the homes of the Mongols, and inside them children are sleeping, their breath soft and slow, curled beneath thick furs while the wind moves over the land outside with a sound like a long, low hum. This is the world that Genghis Khan was born into. Not the world of conquerors, not the world of empires and gold thrones and marble palaces, but this world, the steppe world, the world of wind and horses and the endless grass and the cold that comes at night even in summer, and the stars that tell you where you are when there are no roads, no signs, no landmarks, only the sky. It is the year 1162, or perhaps 1155 or 1167. Even the scholars are not certain, because the Mongols of that era did not record things the way we record them now. They held their history in memory, in song, in the mouths of storytellers who recited long oral epics around fires very much like this one. What they remembered deeply. What they did not write down, they nonetheless kept alive in their blood, in their stories, in the names they gave their children. His name at birth was not Genghis Khan. His name was Temujin. He came into the world gripping a blood clot in his tiny fist, or so the old stories say. The secret history of the Mongols, that extraordinary document composed sometime in the early 13th century, and surviving in fragments and copies that have puzzled and thrilled historians for centuries, tells us this detail with the kind of calm certainty that oral history carries. A blood clot in the fist, a sign, perhaps, a portent, a fist that was already, in its first moment outside the womb, clenched and holding something. His father was Yesuge the Brave, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan within the broader grouping of the Mongol people. His mother was Hoilun, a spirited and resourceful woman whose story we will return to, because her story is not a small one. Together they lived among the scattered tribes and clans of the Mongolian plateau, a world that in the mid-12th century was not one unified thing, but a fractured, turbulent, constantly shifting constellation of competing peoples. To the south lay the vast ancient empire of China, or rather, the Jin dynasty in the north and the Song dynasty in the south, both powerful, both deeply suspicious of the nomadic peoples on their borders, both occasionally willing to pay some of those people to fight others. To the west lay the Tatars, a confederation of tribes who were, at that time, more powerful than the Mongols, and who were allied in complicated ways with the Jin. To the northwest lay the Merkit, to the southwest the Kerets, and woven through all of it like threads in a rough and constantly unravelling fabric were the Naimans, the Onguds, the Jalairs, and dozens of other groups, each with their own chiefs, their own loyalties, their own feuds stretching back so many generations that sometimes no one could even remember what had first caused the killing. This was the world Temujin was born into. Not a world of peace, not a world of safety or abundance, but a world of breathtaking beauty, of extraordinary resilience, of people who had learned to survive in conditions that would break most others, and who had, in that survival, developed a culture of stunning sophistication, even if it looked rough from the outside, even if it was built from felt and bone and horsehair rather than stone and mortar. Breathe in the cold night air of the steppe now. Feel how it fills your lungs, clean, sharp, carrying the faint smell of grass and horse and wood smoke, and something older, something beneath all of it, the smell of deep earth and deep time. Tonight, we're going to sit together by the fire on the Mongolian plain, and we're going to let the story of Temujin, of the boy who became Genghis Khan, who built the largest contiguous empire in the history of the world, drift over us like the wind over the grass, slowly, gently. In the way stories were always meant to be told, in the dark, with the stars overhead, when the mind grows soft and the body grows still, and the story becomes something you feel as much as hear. There is no rush. The steppe is patient. It has been here longer than any empire, and it will be here long after, and tonight it opens itself to us, and we settle in beside the fire, and we listen. The horses graze quietly somewhere in the darkness behind us. The fire pops. The stars wheel overhead on their slow ancient track, and the story begins. The Onon River winds through the northeastern corner of what is now Mongolia, near the border with Russia, a clear, cold river that moves through valleys of birch and pine, and then opens onto flatter land where the grass begins again. In the 12th century, this region was one of the heartlands of the Mongol people, and it was along the banks of this river, in the shadow of Mount Burkan Khaldun, a mountain that the Mongols considered sacred, a place of refuge and prayer, that Temujin spent much of his childhood. He was the eldest son of Yesugei and Hoilun, and from the beginning, the circumstances of his family's life were neither stable nor gentle. His father, Yesugei, was a man of some standing in his clan, but not truly powerful. Not the kind of man who commanded vast herds and many followers. He was brave, which counted for much on the steppe. He was connected to other leaders through blood and alliance, which also counted. But the steppe world was one in which fortune could turn in an instant, where a drought, a raiding party, a shift in alliances could undo in a season what had been built over a generation. Yesugei understood this, and perhaps young Temujin, watching his father navigate this unpredictable world, began to understand it too. The story of how Hoilun came to be Temujin's mother is itself a story of the steppe's violence and its complicated customs. Yesugei had taken Hoilun from a Merkit warrior named Chilidu, taken her while she was travelling with her new husband, riding down out of the hills, stealing her away. This was not an unusual occurrence in the steppe world of the time. Women were taken, given, exchanged, and sometimes stolen as part of the violent and complex social fabric of nomadic life. But Holen did not become a passive or broken figure because of this. She became, by all accounts in the secret history, a woman of fierce intelligence and deep loyalty to her children, a woman who would, in the years to come, hold her family together through conditions that would have destroyed a lesser person. Temujin was perhaps 9 years old when his father set out to find him a bride. This too was custom. Betrothals arranged early, children left with their future in-laws' family for a time as a gesture of good faith and alliance building. Yasuge rode with his eldest son to find a suitable family, and they met, almost by chance it seems, a man of the Ongirat tribe named Daiseshin. Daiseshin had a daughter named Borte, a girl described in the secret history as having light in her eyes and fire in her face. Yasuge was satisfied. The arrangements were made. Young Temujin would stay with Borte's family for a time, and when he came of age she would be his wife. So Yasuge rode home alone. And on the way home, he stopped at a camp of Tatars, the rivals, the enemy, and perhaps not knowing exactly who they were, perhaps knowing but trusting in the laws of steppe hospitality that said a traveller must be fed, he ate with them. He drank their fermented mare's milk, their erag. And the Tatars, who had an old grudge against his family and his clan, put something in his food. Poison. Slow poison. The kind that takes days to work. Yasuge made it home, but he was dying. He sent for his son. He asked that Temujin be brought back from Borte's family before it were too late. A trusted companion rode to fetch the boy. Temujin came home, but by the time he arrived, or very shortly after, Yasuge the Brave was dead. Temujin was 9 years old, perhaps 10. The sources blur here, as they so often do. What is certain is what came next, and what came next was devastating in its swift cruelty. The clan, the very people who'd been his father's people, who had owed loyalty to Yasuge, and should now, by all the customs of the steppe, have transferred that loyalty to his eldest son. The clan abandoned the family. There was a man named Tagutai of the Teichiud clan, a distant relative of Yasuge, who'd been manoeuvring for leadership. With Yasuge gone, Tagutai moved. The clan followed him, and Holen was left with her children, left on the steppe, left without horses enough to follow, without herds enough to survive, abandoned. Picture what this meant. On the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, to be without a clan was not simply to be poor. It was to be nearly without protection, nearly without any of the networks of obligation and reciprocity that made survival possible. The steppe could be extraordinarily harsh, winters that drove temperatures down to levels that could kill the unprepared, summers of blinding heat and drought, springs of flooding meltwater, and at any time the possibility of raiders, of wolves, of accident or illness with no one to help. The clan was everything. The clan was survival. And the clan was gone. But Holen did not give up. The secret history of the Mongols describes her in this period with an almost reverential awe. She gathered her children, Temujin and his brothers and his small sister, and she fed them by pulling wild onions and garlic from the riverbanks. She taught them to fish, to set snares for small animals, to survive on what the land offered. She moved with them through the valley of the Onon, keeping close to the mountain, the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, which she understood to be a place of protection. She was not a woman of softness. She was a woman of the steppe, and she showed her children what the steppe demanded. Patience, resourcefulness, endurance, and the absolute refusal to disappear. Temujin watched his mother. He learned from her. He also had his brothers, particularly one named Kasar, fierce and a good archer, and a younger half-brother from Yesugei's secondary wife, Belgute, who would grow into a giant of a man, immensely strong. And there was Bekta, an older half-brother who was not entirely kind, who sometimes took food from the younger boys, who caused tension and resentment in the small family group. The secret history records the moment when this tension reached its end with a kind of flat, unflinching directness. Temujin and Kasar killed Bekta, shot him with arrows, a cold act, a ruthless one. Their mother was furious. She called them dogs. She invoked the memory of their abandonment. She reminded them that their enemies were outside, not inside. It was a formative moment, the kind of moment that haunts and instructs in equal measure. Temujin was young, perhaps 12 or 13, and already capable of a killing clarity of purpose that would define his life. But the world was not yet done testing him. The Taichud, led by Targutai, came for him. Targutai had decided that even this half-orphaned boy from a broken family represented a threat, or perhaps a prize, a hostage, something to be controlled. They came with riders and took him prisoner, and they did something medieval in its humiliation. They put him in a wooden collar called a kange, a heavy wooden device that locked round the neck and the wrists, making it impossible to use one's hands properly, impossible to sleep comfortably, reducing the wearer to dependence on others for the most basic functions of life. They kept him moving from household to household as a kind of communal prisoner, watched over by different families on different nights. But one night, accounts vary, some say during a festival when the guards were distracted, Temujin managed to use the collar itself as a weapon, knocking a guard down with it and fleeing into the Onon River, hiding there in the cold water and the reeds with only his head above the surface. There was a man named Sorkan Shira, who saw him hiding and did not betray him, helped him instead, a gesture of quiet kindness that Temujin would remember for the rest of his life. He eventually found his way to his family, to the mountains, to safety, out of the Kangwe, out of captivity, but not yet free in any meaningful sense. The true turning point came when Temujin decided to reclaim Borte, the girl he had been promised 2 years before. He returned to her family's camp. He found her, and she was well. Her family had kept the arrangement despite everything that had happened to Temujin's own family, which says something about Daesechen's honour and perhaps his strategic thinking. Temujin married Borte, and in her he received a dowry, a sable fur coat of significant value. It was this coat, this single precious object, that Temujin then used to set the next great event of his life in motion. He rode to find Togrul Khan. Togrul was the leader of the Kherate people, a more powerful confederation than Temujin's own Mongols, and he had been an Anda, a sworn blood brother of Yesugei. Temujin arrived at Togrul's camp, presented the sable coat, and invoked the memory of his father's friendship. He asked for Togrul's alliance, for his support. And Togrul, whether moved by memory or by some calculation of his own, agreed. It was the first great alliance, the first building block. But before Temujin could build anything, disaster struck. The Merkits, the tribe whose man Holan had been taken from all those years ago, when Yesugei had stolen her, came for revenge. They raided the camp in the night. Temujin and his brothers escaped into the mountain. But Borte did not. She was taken. She was gone. The Merkits had their revenge, and now Temujin had to get her back. With Togrul's support, and with another ally, a childhood companion named Jamuka, with whom Temujin had a deep and complicated relationship that would eventually become one of the great tragic arcs of his life, they launched a raid against the Merkit. They struck at night, routing the camp, sending the merkits fleeing, and in the chaos Temujin called out for Borte, and she heard him, and she ran to him, and they were reunited. She was pregnant when they found each other. Whether the child she eventually bore, a son named Joshi, was Temujin's, or the result of her captivity among the merkit, was a question that hovered over Yoshi's life and complicated the line of succession for the empire. Temujin never publicly cast doubt on Yoshi's legitimacy, but the uncertainty was there, quiet and persistent, like a stone in still water. Borte's rescue was more than a personal reunion. It was a demonstration of what alliance could accomplish. It was proof that the son of Yasuge could gather men, lead them, achieve an objective. Word travelled on the steppe as it always did, by mouth, by the network of riders and traders and wandering shamans who connected the scattered camps. People were watching, some were measuring, and there was Jamuka. Jamuka is one of the most fascinating figures in the whole of this story. A man who was, by most accounts, Temujin's equal in intelligence, and possibly his superior in strategic imagination, at least early on. They had been childhood friends, had declared themselves Anda, sworn brothers, exchanging gifts, and making the kind of bond that was, in Mongol culture, supposed to be as strong or stronger than blood. When they rode together against the merkit, they were companions, sharing a blanket at night according to the secret history, which is a detail that has fascinated historians for its intimacy. They spent about a year and a half travelling together after the merkit raid. Their camps joined. But then something happened, a small incident, perhaps trivial by normal standards. Temujin's horses wandered to the front of the column when they moved camp. Jamuka's interpretation of this was that Temujin was setting up his herders' families near the good pasture, while Jamuka was leaving the military men behind. It sounds like an almost absurdly minor thing, but on the steppe such movements and positions were rich with social meaning. People read them the way we read words, and what the followers in the column read was a parting of ways. Some drifted toward Temujin, sensing something, sensing the gravity of a man around whom something enormous was forming. They separated. Two camps, side by side on the vast steppe, then increasingly far apart. Two futures beginning to diverge. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamuka would last decades and would be one of the defining conflicts of the unification of the Mongol people. It would end in one of history's most remarkable moments, a final choice, an offer refused, a death that came as close to a gentle mercy as anything in Temujin's story. But that is many years ahead. For now, we're in the early days. The days of herding and raiding and the careful building of trust. One family, one clan, one small sworn brother at a time. Sit with these early years for a moment, in the quiet. Notice how Temujin's character is being assembled, like a bow being shaped, slowly, under pressure, bent and tested before it is strung. The loss of his father teaches him that safety must be built, not assumed. His mother teaches him that survival requires ingenuity, not luxury. His captivity teaches him what it means to be powerless and what one is willing to do to escape that condition. His alliance with Togrul shows him the power of older established connections. His rescue of Borte teaches him what can be accomplished when men move together with speed and purpose. Every blow lands and reshapes. Every experience adds to a man who is becoming something that the steppe has not quite seen before. Not merely a raider, not merely a clan chief, but someone thinking in a larger patterns. Someone who looks at the fractured, feuding landscape of the Mongolian plateau and sees not just competing pieces but the outline of something that could be made whole. A single empire, one people, one law, one sky. The Mongolian plateau of the late 12th century was, as we've begun to understand, a place of fragmentation, not simply in the political sense, though it was certainly that, a patchwork of competing clans and confederations, but in a deeper sense. The people of the steppe were fragmented in their loyalties, in their sense of identity, in their very understanding of who they were. A man was a Borjigin, a Taichiud, a Merkit, a Karait. Not a Mongol in any unified sense. Not a citizen of anything. A member of a kinship group whose obligations extended only as far as blood and alliance, and the complex web of gifts and favours and sworn brotherhoods that connected the scattered camps. Temujin saw this. Perhaps he had always seen it. And what he began to do, beginning in the years after Borte's rescue and continuing through the decades that would eventually culminate in his proclamation as Genghis Khan in 1206, was to dismantle the old system, not by destroying it overnight, but by offering something better. Something that, once offered, was hard to resist. He offered merit. This was, in the context of the steppe world, a revolutionary idea. In the old system, your position was determined by your birth, by your clan, your bloodline, your kinship connections. A man of low birth who was brave, skilled, and loyal might serve a great chief, but he would do so in a subordinate position, his advancement forever capped by the accident of his origins. And conversely, a man of high birth who was cowardly or incompetent would nonetheless hold his position, because position was inherited, not earned. Temujin reversed this. As he gathered followers, he began to promote men based on ability rather than birth. The men who were loyal to him earliest, who came from the humblest backgrounds, but who showed themselves to be capable, reliable, and devoted. These men were raised up, given command of others, given positions of honour and responsibility, given, in some cases, horses and women and goods from the spoils of raids that far exceeded what their birth would have entitled them to in the old order. In exchange, he demanded something that the old system had never quite managed to demand. Not just service, but complete, unwavering personal loyalty. Loyalty not to a clan, not to a kinship group, but to Temujin himself, and, increasingly, to the idea of something larger than any single man or clan, the idea of a unified people, organised around a new kind of order. Two of his earliest companions illustrate this perfectly. There was a man named Jebe, meaning arrow, who had, in an early battle, shot Temujin's horse out from under him. Temujin captured him afterward and instead of executing him, which would have been typical, interrogated him and then made him an officer. He gave the man who had shot at him a second chance and a position. Jebe went on to become one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the Mongol army. He was brilliant, fast, relentless, and completely loyal to the man who had chosen to see his skill rather than his treachery. There was Bo-Chu, who had helped Temujin recover stolen horses when both were young men, a spontaneous act of kindness and solidarity that Temujin never forgot. Bo-Chu became one of his most trusted generals, a man of no particularly distinguished lineage who nevertheless rose to the very highest levels of command. And there was Subutai. Oh, Subutai. We will return to him at length, because Subutai deserves his own chapter, his own fire, his own long night of storytelling. He is perhaps the greatest military mind ever produced by the Mongol world, and he came from a family of blacksmiths. Not warriors, not clan chiefs, blacksmiths. He offered himself to Temujin as a young man with this extraordinarily humble and poetic declaration, recorded in the secret history. He said he would be like a rat gathering up food, like a black crow gathering up things, and that wherever Temujin sent him, he would go, even to the ends of the earth. Temujin sent him, Subutai went, and the result shook the world. This is the genius, one of the geniuses of Temujin's approach to leadership. He did not care where you came from. He cared what you could do and whether you would be loyal. This made his army a magnet for the talented and the ambitious from every corner of the steppe, because anyone could rise based on performance. The old barriers were gone. The new order was one of capability and commitment. But loyalty alone is not an empire, and Temujin knew this. As his confederation grew through the 1180s and 1190s, he began to develop the structural innovations that would eventually transform a collection of allied tribes into something unprecedented. A true imperial state, organized and permanent rather than temporary and shifting. The first and most visible of these was his approach to the defeated. In the old steppe system, when one group defeated another, the survivors had several possible fates. They could be killed, particularly the men. They could be enslaved. Their women could be taken, their children incorporated into the victorious group, their herds seized, and the survivors who escaped tended to scatter and eventually reorganize under new leadership and eventually fight again. The cycle was endless, the grudges generational, the resolution never final. Temujin broke this cycle with a simple but profound policy. When he defeated a group, he integrated them. He did not destroy the social structure of the defeated clan. He destroyed the leadership that had opposed him. Yes, the khans and chiefs who had resisted were often killed. But the common people, the herders and warriors and women and children, these he absorbed into his own growing confederation. He assigned them to units within his organizational system. He fed them, protected them, gave them a place in the new order, and he asked for their loyalty in return. It worked. It worked again and again. Because the common people of the steppe, the herders, the ordinary warriors, had no particular affection for the chiefs who led them. They followed their chiefs out of obligation and tradition, not love. When a new and more powerful authority offered protection, and a share of the spoils, and a system that treated them as valued members of a larger whole, they adjusted, they folded in, and so with every defeat of a rival confederation, Temujin's forces grew, not just in numbers but in skill, because he was absorbing the warriors of the defeated, men who knew the steppe, who could ride and shoot and navigate the vast landscape, who now served under his banner and his organizational system. The great test came in a series of wars against the major confederations. The Tatars, the most powerful group on the eastern steppe, the ones who had killed his father, were defeated by Temujin and Togrul together around 1202. After the victory, Temujin did something that shocked even some of his own commanders. He ordered a systematic killing of all Tatar men taller than the linchpin of a wagon wheel. In other words, all adult men and older boys. He kept the women and children and integrated them. The policy was brutal, but it was also, in its terrible logic, strategic. The Tatars had been a generational enemy, deeply embedded in the political structures of the region, with strong connections to the Jin dynasty. To leave their male leadership alive was to invite future vengeance. To destroy it completely was to close a chapter. Temujin himself took 2 Tatar women as wives, Yisuge and Yesugen, a choice that was both personal and political, binding the Tatar people to him through intimacy as well as conquest. Then came the Keraits. Togrul, the man who had been Temujin's patron and ally, had grown old, and around him had gathered advisors and relatives who saw Temujin's rising power as a threat. There was Toghrul's son, Sengum, who was jealous and fearful of Temujin's influence. They conspired. They invited Temujin to a meeting, ostensibly to formalize a marriage alliance, and planned to ambush him. But Temujin was warned. He escaped, and then he did what he always did when betrayed. He turned the crisis into a campaign. The war against the Keret was hard. Temujin was nearly defeated at the Battle of Kalakalgid Sands in 1203. He was driven back, his forces scattered. He regrouped at a lake. The secret history describes this moment with a quiet, almost meditative quality. Temujin sitting by the water, sending out messengers to find his scattered men, patiently rebuilding. It took months, but he rebuilt. And when the Keret fell, and Toghrul fled and was killed by chance, his head brought back to Temujin by people who did not know who it was. The Keret people, tens of thousands of them, folded into the growing confederation. Then the Naimans, on the western steppe. Under their king, Tayang Khan, the Naimans represented the last major power that could challenge Temujin on the plateau. They had literacy, they used the Uyghur script, and they had a certain sophistication in administration that most of the other steppe peoples lacked. They fell too in 1204. And there was Jamuka. Jamuka had allied with the Naimans. He had fought against Temujin through the later stages of the Great Unification Campaign, always on the other side, always the shadow to Temujin's substance. He was a gifted leader and a genuine alternative vision for the steppe, the old way, the aristocratic way, the way of birth and blood rather than merit and new order. He represented everything Temujin was replacing. When the Naimans collapsed, Jamuka's companions eventually turned on him and brought him to Temujin, expecting reward perhaps, expecting gratitude from the conqueror for delivering his old enemy. Temujin executed the companions. He would not reward disloyalty, even disloyalty toward an enemy. That was a principle he held to with iron consistency throughout his life. Loyalty was sacred. The man who betrayed his own lord to serve a new one could not be trusted by the new lord either. And then he turned to Jamuka. The secret history gives us this scene with a quality that is almost unbearably poignant. Two old friends, former Andas, facing each other at the end of everything. Temujin offered Jamuka a place at his side, asked him to come back, to be together again as they had been on the steppe when they were young men, sharing a blanket under the stars. Jamuka refused. He said, in words that the secret history preserves with a kind of reverent sadness, that there was not room under the sky for two suns, that Temujin was the sun, and that Jamuka standing beside him would only create shadow. He asked to die without bloodshed, without his blood touching the earth, which was how a man of noble birth was supposed to die in Mongol custom, the neck broken, or the body pressed under a board rather than cut. Temujin gave him this, and Jamuka was gone. The last great rival, the last alternative. The steppe now had one centre of gravity. In the spring of 1206, at the headwaters of the Onon River, the river of his childhood, the river where he had once hid in the reeds with a kangwe around his neck, Temujin called a great gathering, a kurultai, a grand assembly of all the clans and peoples and leaders who had now pledged their allegiance to him. A great white banner of 9 tails was raised, and the assembled people gave him a new name, Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of Genghis has been debated by scholars for centuries. It may derive from a Turkic word meaning ocean, universal, boundless, overflowing in every direction, or it may be related to a word meaning strong or fierce. The title Khan meant ruler, leader, the one who commands. Together the name meant something like universal ruler or oceanic Khan, a name as vast as the sky overhead, as endless as the steppe in every direction. He was approximately 40 years old. He had survived poverty, captivity, betrayal, ambush, near defeat, and loss. He had built something from nothing. And now, by the unanimous acclaim of the assembled peoples of the Mongolian plateau, he was their Khan, their singular sovereign leader. The fire crackles softly, the horses breathe, the stars turn overhead. A man has become a myth, and the myth is just beginning. Now we come to the part that historians and military theorists and strategists have returned to again and again, century after century, marvelling at it from every angle, unable to quite explain how a people from the steppe, nomadic, without cities, without a tradition of siege warfare, without the kind of heavy infantry that had defined most great armies of the age, managed to defeat not just their neighbours but the great civilizations of the world. How did they do it? Part of the answer is organisational. We will talk about that separately. But part of it is purely strategic. The way the Mongol army thought about warfare, the way it moved, the way it fought, the way it refused to behave the way its enemies expected it to behave. Let us begin with the most fundamental thing: the horse. The Mongol relationship with horses was unlike anything in the civilized world. A Mongol warrior did not simply ride a horse. He was, in some sense, made of horses. From childhood, Mongol boys were taught to ride before they could properly walk. The secret history gives us images of children strapped to gentle mares, learning the motion, learning to belong to the animal's movement rather than fighting against it. By the time a Mongol warrior was a man, he had spent more hours on horseback than on foot. He could eat on horseback, sleep on horseback in short intervals, shoot on horseback with remarkable accuracy even at a full gallop. The horses themselves were not the large, showy war horses of European knights. They were the Mongolian native horse, sturdy, relatively small, ugly by some standards, with thick necks and short legs and shaggy coats. They could survive on the steppe in conditions that would kill a more delicate animal. They could dig through snow with their hooves to find grass. They could go without water for astonishing periods, and they were numerous. Each Mongol warrior travelled with a string of horses, typically 5 to 13 animals, rotating between them so that none was ever exhausted. This gave the Mongol army a speed and endurance of movement that was almost incomprehensible to their enemies. The Mongol army could cover 60 miles in a day on campaign. 60 miles. A medieval European army on campaign might manage 10 or 15. The Mongol army moved like weather, like a storm that appeared far away and then arrived before you had finished telling people it was coming. Speed was not just a tactical advantage, it was a strategic one. It allowed the Mongols to strike before their enemies had finished preparing, before allies had arrived, before fortifications had been reinforced. It allowed them to attack on multiple fronts simultaneously, because their columns could separate and move independently at a pace that no enemy force could match. By the time an enemy commander had gathered intelligence about where the Mongols were, where they were heading, how many there were, the situation had already changed completely. Now add to this the arrow. The Mongol composite bow is one of the most remarkable weapons in human history. Built from layers of horn, wood and sinew, materials that work together under compression and tension in ways that wood alone cannot. It was shorter than the great war bows of other cultures, but perhaps more powerful, and more importantly it was designed to be used from horseback. The Mongol archer could nock, draw and release an arrow while riding at full gallop, shooting in any direction, including backward the famous Parthian shot, with accuracy that terrified the soldiers of settled civilizations who faced them. The effective range of these bows was around 200 to 300 meters in skilled hands. The armor of most armies of the period could not reliably stop a Mongol arrow at closer range, and the Mongol warriors could release arrow after arrow, trained to shoot perhaps 6 arrows per minute or more from horseback, without closing to melee range, without putting themselves at significant risk from enemy infantry. This was a fundamental strategic asymmetry. The Mongols could kill you from a distance while moving faster than you could catch them. But the most sophisticated military innovation, perhaps the most imitated and studied military tactic in all of history, was the feigned retreat. The feigned retreat was exactly what it sounds like. The Mongol cavalry would make contact with the enemy force, engage briefly, and then appear to flee in panic. The enemy, seeing the terrifying horsemen apparently running away, would break formation to pursue, because pursuit in medieval warfare was how you turned a battle into a rout, how you killed the fleeing enemy and gathered plunder. It was irresistible. It was what you were trained to do. You chased. And then, after the enemy had been drawn out, strung out, separated from their formation and their support, the retreating Mongols would suddenly swing around, individually, without being commanded in that moment, because they had drilled this movement hundreds of times, and each warrior knew exactly what to do. And the enemy who thought he was chasing a fleeing army found himself surrounded by warriors who had never been afraid at all, who had simply been moving him into position. The feigned retreat required extraordinary discipline. Real flight and feigned flight look identical from the inside. The warrior performing the feigned retreat had to trust completely that his companions were doing the same thing, that the timing would hold, that the turn would come. This required the kind of training and trust that only comes from years of shared practice and a hierarchical command structure that the men believed in absolutely. That command structure was the decimal system. Genghis Khan organized his army into units of 10, the arban. 10 arbans made a unit of 100, the jagun. 10 jaguns made a unit of 1,000, the mingun. And 10 minguns made the largest unit, the tumen, of 10,000 men. Every man in this system had exactly one immediate commander, the leader of his unit of 10. Every leader of 10 reported to the leader of 100, and so on up the chain to the Khan himself. This system had several remarkable properties. First, it was clean. Every man knew who he answered to. There was no ambiguity about authority, no competing chains of command, no room for the kind of confused contradictory orders that plagued armies of more politically complex societies. Second, it destroyed the old tribal structure. When Genghis Khan organized his forces into tumens, he deliberately mixed members of different clans and tribes within the same units. Your unit of 10 was not your kinship group. It was your military family, the men assigned to fight alongside you, regardless of where they came from. This had a profound effect on loyalty and identity. Over time, the unit became the primary social group for the warrior, replacing the clan. Loyalty ran upward through the military hierarchy rather than outward through kinship networks. Third, it was scalable. You could add units of 10, then hundreds, then thousands in a modular way, and the structure remained coherent. This is why the Mongol army could incorporate defeated peoples so smoothly. You simply assigned them to units within the decimal structure, and they became part of the machine. Fourth, it created clear accountability. If a unit of 10 failed, fled without orders, abandoned a position, committed an atrocity that was not sanctioned, the commander of that unit was responsible. This applied all the way up the chain. Commanders were rewarded for the performance of their units and punished for their failures. The clarity of this accountability system made the Mongol officer corps extraordinarily careful and professional. The intelligence network that supported this army was another area of genius. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan sent out scouts, and not just cavalry scouts of the kind any army used. He sent merchants who travelled ahead of the army and reported on the political situation in the target area. Who was allied with whom, what the food supply was like, what the roads were, where the important cities and fords and passes were. He sent spies, men who spoke the languages of the target civilization, who could blend into the population, listen, and report. He gathered information about potential enemies for years before striking, building up a comprehensive picture of their strengths, weaknesses, internal divisions and vulnerabilities. This intelligence gathering is one of the least celebrated but most important aspects of the Mongol military system. The campaigns that look in retrospect like lightning strikes were, in reality, the product of years of careful preparation. Genghis Khan rarely, if ever, went to war in ignorance. He went to war knowing the ground, knowing the enemy, knowing where the divisions were and how to exploit them. He also used psychological warfare with extraordinary sophistication. To an approaching Mongol army, cities faced a stark and carefully communicated choice. Surrender and be spared, join the empire, continue your life largely as before but under Mongol authority, or resist and face the full consequence of Mongol wrath, which was total and spectacular and designed to be so visible, so absolute, that the next city on the route would surrender without a fight. This was not simply rage or bloodlust. It was, in its terrible way, strategic. Every city that was made an example saved the Mongol army from having to besiege the next one. The message travelled ahead of the army, carried by refugees, by merchants, by the simple terror of survivors who had seen what happened to those who resisted. By the time the Mongol army arrived at a city that had heard these stories, the psychological war was already more than half won. And when cities did surrender, Genghis Khan was, for the most part, true to his word. He left the population in place, imposed taxes, often kept local administrators in their positions with Mongol supervisors, and protected the trade routes. The pragmatic mercy of surrender was real, which made the devastating consequence of resistance more credible, not less. There was one more innovation that deserves to be mentioned in this discussion of military genius, and that is the Mongol approach to siege warfare. The Mongols of the early period, before the great campaigns, had almost no experience with siege warfare. Nomadic people did not build or besiege cities. This was a profound limitation in a world where much of the wealth was concentrated in walled urban centres. Centres that could, in principle, simply close their gates and wait for the nomads to grow bored and leave. Genghis Khan solved this problem with characteristic pragmatism. He hired the expertise he did not have. When he began encountering walled cities in northern China, the territories of the Jin dynasty, he captured or recruited Chinese engineers and siege specialists. He learned how to build and use catapults, mangonels, ballistae, and later the great counterweight trebuchets of the Islamic world. He incorporated Persian, Chinese, and eventually European siege technology into the Mongol military toolkit. By the time of the Great Western Campaigns, the Mongol army arrived at the walls of Central Asian cities with a full siege train, catapults, battering rams, siege towers, engineers who could dig undermining tunnels and divert water supplies and do everything necessary to reduce a fortification to rubble. The combination of speed, archery, the feigned retreat, the decimal system, the intelligence network, the psychological warfare, and the incorporation of siege technology created a military machine that was, for its era, nearly invincible. Not because it was invulnerable. The Mongols were defeated sometimes. They failed at the Sea of Japan. They were stopped in the forests of Poland and Hungary, only because the terrain limited their cavalry's effectiveness. They could be surprised and hurt. They were not gods, but they were extraordinary. And understanding how they were extraordinary, what specific choices, what organizational decisions, what tactical innovations made them so, is one of the most rewarding intellectual exercises in all of military history. The fire burns low, the night deepens. Far out on the steppe, a wolf howls once and then falls silent, and somewhere a Mongol warrior is sleeping with his horse's reins looped around his wrist, ready to move in an instant, the bow already strung beside him. The machine rests. Tomorrow it will wake and move again, 60 miles before the enemy knows it has left. An army can conquer, but conquering and ruling are different things, utterly different things. History is full of brilliant conquerors who built nothing lasting, who swept through civilizations like a fire and left only ash, the ashes eventually covered by the next civilization, which barely remembered the conqueror's name. Genghis Khan understood this, and so, alongside the military innovations, he built the structures of governance that would allow his conquest to become an empire, and not just any empire, but the largest contiguous empire in human history, one that at its fullest extent covered approximately 24 million square kilometers. Stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe, from the forests of Siberia to the Persian Gulf. This required more than soldiers. It required law, communication, a system of authority that could function over distances so vast that a message from one end of the empire to the other might take months to arrive. Let us begin with the law. The Great Yasa, sometimes translated as the Great Law or the Great Decree, was Genghis Khan's codification of law for his empire. Its exact contents are somewhat debated among scholars, because no single complete version of the Yasa has survived intact. What we know comes from references in various Persian, Arabic, Chinese, and Armenian sources who mention specific provisions, and from the general patterns of Mongol governance that are consistent across sources. The Yasa was not a law code in the way that Rome had law, or that the great Islamic legal traditions had law. It was not a philosophically elaborated system with deep roots in religious or natural law theory. It was practical. It addressed the things that needed addressing: prohibitions on theft and deception, rules about the treatment of ambassadors, regulations governing the sharing of plunder, standards for the treatment of those who surrendered versus those who resisted, requirements of loyalty to the Khan and to one's unit commanders. Several of its provisions were remarkable for their era. One was religious freedom. The Yasa explicitly protected the freedom of all religions within the empire. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, animists of various kinds, all were to be free to practice their faith. Their clergy were to be exempt from taxation. Their places of worship were to be protected. This was not a policy born of personal religious conviction on Genghis Khan's part. He appears to have been a sincere practitioner of the traditional Mongolian shamanic religion, with a deep personal reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky, but of strategic wisdom. An empire that encompassed so many different peoples and faiths could not afford to make enemies of all the clergy and all the religious communities within it. Better to win them over, protect them, use their administrative and educational infrastructure as a resource. It worked. Christian monks in Central Asia wrote with astonishment of the tolerance they encountered under Mongol rule. Muslim scholars found that their madrasas continued to function. Chinese Buddhist temples were protected. The Mongol Empire was, at its height, one of the most religiously diverse and tolerant political entities in the medieval world, not out of high-minded idealism, but out of the ruthlessly practical recognition that diversity of belief was a fact that had to be managed rather than eliminated. Another provision of the Yasa concerned the prohibition on deception in trade. Merchants within the empire were to be protected, and their contracts were to be honoured. This was revolutionary in a world where trade was often subject to arbitrary taxation, banditry, confiscation, and the general violence of unstable political conditions. Under the Yasa, a merchant who travelled the roads of the Mongol Empire had legal protection that was, in many ways, stronger than what was available in the settled kingdoms around him. This protection for merchants was not purely altruistic. It was deeply practical. Trade generated revenue. Taxes, tolls, goods flowing into the imperial system. Merchants also served as intelligence assets, as we have seen. And the culture of commerce that the Mongols fostered along the Silk Road would become one of the most significant legacies of the empire, the period known as the Pax Mongolica, when the roads from China to Europe were safer than they had been in centuries, and when goods and ideas flowed in both directions with unprecedented freedom. But how do you govern something so vast? How do you communicate across 24 million square kilometres in a world without telegraph or telephone or the internet? The answer was the YAM. The YAM, or JAM, was a relay station system of extraordinary sophistication and ambition. Across the entire empire, at regular intervals along the main roads and tracks, stations were established. At each station, horses were kept, fed, and ready. Riders were stationed there waiting. A messenger carrying official imperial communications would arrive at a station, hand his message to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and the message would continue without pause. The exhausted rider would rest, the exhausted horse would recover, and within days or weeks, rather than months, a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other. The stations also served travellers and merchants. An official traveller carrying the right pass, a pesa, a tablet of gold or silver or iron depending on one's rank, could requisition horses, food, and lodging at any station along the route. The YAM was, in effect, the postal system, the Pony Express, and the imperial highway system all in one. The logistical demands of maintaining the YAM were enormous. Each station required a staff to care for the horses, prepare food, and manage the flow of travellers. The local populations near each station were taxed specifically to support it. The system required the kind of sustained administrative attention and resource commitment that only a true empire, not just a confederation of tribes, could provide. And then there was the census. Genghis Khan ordered regular censuses of the populations under his control. This allowed him to know, with reasonable accuracy, how many people lived in each region, what their resources were, how much they could be taxed, how many men were available for military service. The census was not merely an exercise in data collection. It was the foundation of rational governance, the basis for fair, or at least consistent taxation, the tool that prevented local administrators from skimming too much off the top without it being noticed. The census also fed the merit system, because what Genghis Khan was trying to build was not just a conquest empire, a parasitic system that extracted from conquered peoples and gave nothing back, but something more complex, a network of territories that contributed to the whole and received the protection and benefits of the whole in return. he recruited administrators from the peoples he conquered. The Uyghur people of Central Asia had a tradition of literacy and administrative skill. They were absorbed into the Mongol system as clerks, record keepers, and scribes. The Mongolian language itself was given a writing system based on the Uyghur script, giving the empire a written administrative language for the first time. Chinese administrators who had served the Jin dynasty were sometimes kept in their positions, now reporting to Mongol overseers. Persian bureaucrats continued to manage the accounts of the lands they had always managed, under new masters. This policy of incorporating the administrative talent of conquered peoples was not unique to the Mongols. The Romans did something similar. The Ottomans would later do it brilliantly with the devshirme system, but the Mongol version was notable for its speed and flexibility. The empire expanded so quickly that it could not have functioned at all without this rapid incorporation of existing administrative structures. There is something remarkable to sit with here, in the quiet of the night. We think of the Mongol Empire as a thing of violence, and it was, in its building, often terrifyingly violent. But the violence was, in a sense, the scaffolding. The building itself was something else, a vast administrative structure of unprecedented complexity and sophistication, held together by law, by communication, by the professional loyalty of a meritocratic military, and by the common benefit of peace and trade that the Mongol system provided to the peoples within it. The stars are very bright tonight over the steppe. The wind has softened to a whisper. In the felt tent nearby, someone is writing in the Uyghur script that has been adapted for Mongolian, writing the orders of the Khan, the records of the census, the accounts of the treasury. The pen moves across the paper with a soft, steady sound. The empire is alive in its paperwork as much as in its armies. It breathes through its roads. It thinks through its messengers. It is a living thing, an organizational creature of unprecedented complexity. And it was built from the steppe by a man who had once hidden in a river with a wooden collar around his neck. The wars of Genghis Khan are both vast and specific, campaigns that covered thousands of miles, that involved dozens of separate engagements, that lasted sometimes for years, that brought down empires and cities that had stood for centuries. To describe them all in complete detail would require not one night but many. Tonight, we will move through them as one might move through a landscape from a great height, seeing the shapes of things, the sweep and flow of events, the patterns that emerge when you look at the whole rather than any single battle. Begin in the south, in China. The Jin dynasty of northern China, the dynasty that had poisoned Yesugei, that had long played the Mongol tribes against each other, that had paid the Tatars and used the divisions of the steppe as a buffer against exactly the kind of unified threat that Genghis Khan now represented, was the first major civilizational target. The initial campaigns against the Jin began in 1211, 5 years after the Great Kurultai on the Unon. Genghis Khan crossed the Gobi Desert. The Gobi, that vast expanse of stone and sand that most commanders would have avoided, would have considered impassable for an army, with perhaps 100,000 warriors, and emerged on the other side directly into Jin territory. The shock of the crossing itself was part of the strategy. The Jin had not fortified against an approach through the Gobi because they considered it impossible. The Great Wall, that monument to the defensive ambitions of Chinese civilization, proved less useful than it might have been. The wall in the early 13th century was not the unified, continuous structure of later dynasties. It was patchy, partially maintained, and manned by Jin and Yurchen soldiers who, in some cases, were already more sympathetic to the incoming army than to the dynasty they nominally served. The wall was breached. The Mongol cavalry poured through. What followed was several years of systematic, methodical destruction of Jin power in northern China. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, roughly where modern Beijing stands today, was besieged and eventually fell in 1215. When it did, it burned for a month. The wealth of the city, silks, gold, porcelain, weapons, food, was loaded onto Mongol wagons and carried north. The skilled workers, engineers, craftsmen, doctors, scholars were identified and spared, their skills too valuable to destroy. The rest was ashes. Genghis Khan did not complete the conquest of the Jin. That was left to his successors, and the Jin dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234, 7 years after his death. But he broke it. He reduced it from an empire that dominated northern China to a rump state clinging to its southern territories, never again a serious threat to Mongolian power. Then came Xixia. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, in what is now northwestern China, had been a tributary state that paid tribute to the Mongols, but had refused to provide troops for the Jin campaign. This was an unforgivable defiance. The Mongols campaigned against Xixia multiple times. It was a hard nut to crack, defended by walls and the difficult terrain of the Ordos Desert and the Loess Plateau. Genghis Khan was still engaged in the final campaign against Xixia when he died in 1227. The Tanguts were destroyed almost utterly. Their royal line was extinguished, their cities razed, their culture largely obliterated. Of all the campaigns in the Mongol history, the destruction of Xixia may be the most total. Now turn west, much further west. The Khwarezmian Empire was, in the early 13th century, one of the most powerful Islamic states in the world. Its Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, ruled a vast territory stretching from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf, from the Aral Sea to the borders of India. He was powerful, wealthy, and had a large and experienced army. He was also, by most accounts, a deeply unwise man in some crucial moments. The catastrophe began with the trade mission. Genghis Khan, who was genuinely interested in trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, commerce as much as conquest was on his mind in the West in the early years, sent a large caravan of merchants and diplomats to Muhammad's court. The governor of the frontier city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, seized the caravan, accused them of being spies, and had them all executed. Perhaps 400 men. Muhammad, when Genghis Khan sent an ambassador demanding explanation and justice, had the ambassador killed and the 2 accompanying envoys returned with their beards shaved off. A profound and deliberate insult. This was, from any strategic perspective, an almost unimaginably catastrophic mistake. Genghis Khan prepared for 3 years. He gathered perhaps 150,000 warriors. He gathered intelligence, detailed, comprehensive intelligence about the Khwarezmian realm, its political divisions. There was significant tension between Muhammad and his mother, who controlled key parts of the power structure, its geography, its defences, its economic arteries. And then he came. The campaign that followed, from 1219 to 1221, is one of the most devastating in recorded history. The great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Merv, were reduced to rubble and ash. The populations were sorted. The skilled craftsmen and scholars were taken away. The rest were killed or enslaved. The irrigation systems of the Oxus Valley, which had sustained agriculture for millennia, were deliberately destroyed, turning fertile land to desert in some areas for generations. The secret history tells us of an episode in Bukhara, one of the great centres of Islamic learning and commerce, where Genghis Khan rode into the Friday Mosque, the Grand Mosque, the sacred heart of the city, and addressed the assembled population. He told them that he was the punishment of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. Whether he said exactly this is unknowable. But the story captures something true about how the Mongol conquests were experienced by those who survived them, as something that seemed to transcend ordinary human warfare, as something elemental, as a judgment arriving from outside the normal order of the world. Muhammad himself fled, chased across his own empire by two of Genghis Khan's greatest commanders, Jebi and Subutai, in one of the most extraordinary pursuits in military history. Muhammad died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, having lost everything, having given up his empire, his cities, his people. He died wearing a borrowed shirt, and Jebi and Subutai, rather than returning after the pursuit, kept going. They were given permission to continue west to scout the lands beyond the Khwarezmian Empire and to do whatever they thought best. What followed was a military reconnaissance that covered roughly 8,000 miles in 3 years. They rode through northern Persia, into the Caucasus, through Georgia and Armenia, across the steppes north of the Caspian Sea, defeated a combined force of the Kipchak and Russian princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, and then circled back east to rejoin the main Mongol forces. They were previewing the next war, the one that their successors would eventually fight, when Batu Khan and Subutai returned to Europe a decade later and drove all the way to the Adriatic Sea. The speed and scope of the Western campaigns left the Islamic world in shock, from which some regions never fully recovered. Persia, which had been one of the greatest cultural centres of the medieval world, lost perhaps half its population. The city of Merv, once called the Queen of the World, a centre of learning and commerce with perhaps 1 million inhabitants, was destroyed so completely that it never regained its former greatness. These are losses that ache even across the centuries, even in the calm and quiet of a night like this one. And yet, the Mongol campaigns also, in their aftermath, created the conditions for one of history's most remarkable periods of cross-cultural exchange. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, that followed the conquest of most of Eurasia connected civilizations that had previously been separated by the political fragmentation of the landscape. Chinese technologies moved west, Islamic medical and astronomical knowledge moved east. European merchants travelled roads they had never before been able to travel safely. Marco Polo's famous journey was possible precisely because the Mongol Empire had made the Silk Road safe. The destruction was real. The exchange that came after was also real. Both are part of the story. Both deserve to be held with equal seriousness. And now we approach the part where Genghis Khan's own story ends. He was aging. The campaigns had never stopped. Not for a year. Barely for a season. He had been fighting since he was a teenager, and he was now in his 60s, which was old by any standard, and especially old for a man who had lived such a hard and violent life. His body bore the marks of decades of riding, of wounds, of the physical demands of the steppe. In 1225 or 1226, while on the Xixia campaign, he was thrown from his horse, or perhaps he fell ill, the source is not entirely clear. He continued directing the campaign even as his health declined. He knew, perhaps, that he was near the end. There is a passage in various accounts of a conversation with advisors about the future of the empire, about how to govern what he had built. He was clear-eyed about succession. He designated his third son, Ogedei, as his successor, not his eldest, Yochi, whose paternity was uncertain and who had in any case died earlier in the same year, not his impetuous second son, Chagatai, but Ogedei, whom he judged to be the best suited for the demands of governing an empire. In the summer of 1227, somewhere in the Ordos region near the Yellow River, Genghis Khan died. He was perhaps 60, perhaps 65. The cause of his death is uncertain. A fall from a horse, a fever, internal injuries, possibly the bubonic plague, possibly typhoid. The sources disagree. His body was carried back to Mongolia, to the sacred mountain Burkan Khaldun, the mountain that had sheltered him in his most desperate years, the mountain he had prayed to before battles, the mountain he had always considered his home. The burial location was kept secret, a Mongol tradition for great rulers, that their burial place not be disturbed, not be looted or venerated in ways that might attract attention. The burial party killed anyone they met along the route to preserve the secret. At the burial site, 40 horses were killed. Some sources say 40 concubines as well, sacrificed to serve him in whatever came after this world. The location has never been conclusively found. Somewhere under the Mongolian earth, the man who built the largest empire in history lies undisturbed. The grass grows over him, the horses graze above him, the stars wheel in the sky he always loved, the sky he called Father, the eternal blue sky of Tengri. It is a quiet ending for so enormous a life. We have spoken of war and strategy and organization. Now let us slow down even further, settle even more deeply into the quiet, and talk about what life actually looked like for the people of the Mongol Empire. Not the Khans and the generals, though we will return to them, but the ordinary people, the herders and warriors and women and children who made up the great mass of this civilization. Let us begin with the ger. The gyr, sometimes called a yurt from the Turkic word, is one of humanity's most elegant inventions. It is a round, portable dwelling made from a latticed wooden frame, covered with layers of felt made from compressed sheep's wool. It is warm in winter, and, with its central opening, the tuno to the sky, and the door opened, remarkably cool in summer. It can be assembled by a practiced family in about 2 hours. It can be taken apart in the same time and loaded onto 2 or 3 pack animals or ox-drawn carts. Inside a Mongol gyr of the 13th century, the space was organized with great intentionality. The north side, the side directly opposite the door, which always faced south to take advantage of sunlight and to indicate the direction of home, was the most honoured position, reserved for the head of the household and for honoured guests. The west side was associated with women, with the household tools, with the domestic space. The east side was for men, for weapons, for horses' gear. In the centre was the fire, always burning, fed with dried dung, argol, from the herds, which burns slow and steady and with less smoke than wood. Above the fire, through the tuno, you could always see the sky. Day or night, the sky was part of the interior of the home. This is not accidental. In Mongol culture, Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was the supreme deity, the source of authority and blessing, and the overarching presence that gave the Khan his mandate to rule. To keep the sky visible through the tuno of the home was to keep the divine presence within the household's daily life. Food in the Mongol gyr was simple, hearty, and adapted perfectly to the resources of the steppe. Meat was the primary sustenance. Lamb and mutton were most common, beef less so because cattle were less efficient on the steppe than sheep, and horse meat was eaten in difficult times or for special occasions. Meat was eaten boiled, dried, into hard, long-lasting strips called borts, or raw in emergencies. Dairy was the other great staple. Fermented mare's milk, airag, was the beloved drink of the steppe, mildly alcoholic, slightly sour, deeply nourishing. Dried curds, hard cheeses, boiled cream, dairy products took dozens of forms and provided sustenance through the long winter months. There was almost no bread, no grain, no vegetable in the traditional Mongol diet. This was a matter not of preference but of ecology. The steppe does not support grain agriculture without irrigation, and the nomadic lifestyle left no time to tend a garden. What vegetables existed in the diet came from trade, or, in later years when the empire reached agricultural regions, from tribute. Tea came into the Mongol diet from China, pressed tea bricks, boiled with water and then with milk and sometimes salt, in a form that is still drunk in Mongolia today. When it arrived, it was embraced enthusiastically, and the ritual of tea preparation became part of the domestic fabric of Mongol life. The daily rhythms of Mongol camp life were organized around the needs of the animals. Horses and sheep and cattle had to be moved to fresh pasture regularly. This was the fundamental logic of nomadic life, the reason for constant movement. The great seasonal migrations, the Khoton, covered hundreds of miles over the course of a year, south to warmer winter pastures in the valleys, north to the rich summer grasslands of the high steppe. Every member of the family had a role in this perpetual movement. Children as young as 4 or 5 were given tasks, carrying small items, watching over lambs, fetching water. By 7 or 8, boys were riding. By 12 or 13, they were hunters and could be soldiers. Women were the keepers of the ger in the fullest sense, not merely domestic caretakers, but the managers of everything that happened within and around the household. A Mongol woman's responsibilities were vast. Making felt, a labour-intensive process of cleaning, carding and compressing wool, sewing and maintaining clothing, producing all the dairy products, overseeing the loading and unloading of the household's possessions for the seasonal migrations, managing the stores of food and supplies, and in many cases serving as the primary decision-maker when her husband was away, which, in the era of conquest, was often for years at a time. This was not a society where women were sequestered or passive. The extraordinary women of the Mongol story, Hoylun, Borte, Sorkaktani Beki, the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan who would effectively save the empire after his son's tumultuous reigns, and whose 4 sons would each become Khan. These women were exceptional, but they were exceptional in a cultural context that gave women genuine authority and genuine respect in specific domains. We will return to the women in our and more section, because they deserve much more than a brief mention. The culture of the steppe had its own art, its own music, its own profound ritual life. Shamans, Bowe, were central figures in Mongol religious practice, serving as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, performing rituals of healing and protection and divination. The great shaman Teb Tengri, also called Kokochu, was a powerful figure in the early years of Genghis Khan's reign, so powerful that he eventually threatened the Khan's own authority and was killed for it, his back broken in a wrestling match by Kasar, Temujin's brother, in an episode that illustrated the limits of religious authority in the Mongol system. No one, not even the shaman who helped legitimize the Khan's divine mandate, could operate outside the supreme authority of Genghis Khan himself. Music moved through Mongol life like the wind through the grass, constant, invisible, present. The morinkur, the horsehead fiddle, was perhaps the central instrument, its sound said to carry the voices of the horses and the resonance of the steppe itself. Long epic poems, the kind from which the secret history was eventually drawn, were sung rather than recited, performed by bards who could hold thousands of lines in memory and recite them through the long nights of winter. These performances were not entertainment in a trivial sense. They were the living memory of the people, the record of who they were and where they came from, and what they owed to each other. At night, in the Jur, the fire burned low and the stories were told. The children were asleep beneath their furs, their breathing soft and steady, and the adults sat in the orange glow, and the grandfather or the grandmother or the travelling bard told the old stories. The stories of the ancient ancestors, the stories of the great battles, the stories of the blue wolf and the fallow doe from whom the Mongols believed all their people descended, and outside the steppe was vast and dark and quiet. The horses grazed in the darkness, the stars turned overhead. The fire in the Jur was a small, warm point of light in the enormous night. This is the world from which the greatest empire in history grew, not from palaces or universities or temples or libraries, from felt and bone and horsehair, from the daily labour of women and the nightly stories of grandparents, from the cold air and the hot tea and the slow, patient turning of the seasons on the ancient grass. We must, in a night like this, in a spirit of honest storytelling, sit quietly with the harder parts of this story. The Mongol conquest killed millions of people. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. The modern historical scholarship, drawing on census records from before and after the Mongol campaigns, suggests that the population of China dropped by something in the range of 30 to 40 million people between the early 13th century and the mid-13th century. The population of Iran may have been cut in half. Specific regions, the Khwarezmian heartland, the Tangut Kingdom, parts of Eastern Europe struck by the Western campaigns, experienced losses that were genuinely catastrophic, from which some areas took centuries to recover. Cities that had been among the most brilliant centres of human civilization, Merv, Samarkand, Baghdad, which fell to Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu in 1258, were razed. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, that extraordinary repository of ancient and medieval knowledge, was said to have been thrown into the Tigris River, its books turning the water black with ink. Whether that specific detail is literally true or legendary, the loss of knowledge and culture in Baghdad's fall was real and profound. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia and Central Asia, systems of extraordinary sophistication that had sustained dense populations for millennia, the technical achievement of dozens of generations of engineers and farmers, were in many cases deliberately destroyed. The land reverted to scrub and desert in areas where it had been gardens. Some of those areas have never fully recovered. How do we hold this? How do we sit with the fact that the man we've been admiring for his organizational genius, his strategic brilliance, his progressive policies of merit and religious tolerance, how do we hold the fact that this same man was responsible for one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history? There is no clean answer, no resolution that makes it comfortable. History rarely provides comfort of that kind. What we can do is try to understand the Mongol logic, not to excuse it, but to comprehend it. The mass destruction that accompanied Mongol resistance was, from the Mongol perspective, not simply revenge or bloodlust, though those elements were certainly present. It was strategic. The terrifying consequences of resistance were designed to make resistance so costly that most cities and peoples would choose to surrender rather than fight. And in many cases this logic worked. The Mongol Empire incorporated vast populations without the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that would have been necessary if every city had to be reduced by force. There was also a cultural dimension. Nomadic people and settled people had very different values around what was worth protecting. To a Mongol, a city was not in itself a thing of particular value. It was the people and their skills and their herds and their goods that mattered. The physical infrastructure of a city was less important than the human capital within it. This led to decisions that were catastrophic from the perspective of settled civilizations: burning cities, destroying irrigation systems, slaughtering urban populations. But that made a certain brutal sense from within the nomadic worldview that had formed Genghis Khan, none of which makes the deaths acceptable, none of which erases the suffering of the millions who lived and died in the path of the Mongol armies. What it does do is place those events in a context of strategic logic, cultural difference, and the specific circumstances of the medieval world, that allows us to understand them, even if understanding is not the same as forgiving. The Mongol Empire was not the worst or most destructive empire in history. The 20th century alone provides competitors that in absolute numbers of deaths exceeded anything the Mongols accomplished. But it was, in its specific century, one of the most dramatically transformative and in many regions devastatingly destructive forces in human history. Both things are true: the brilliant organization and the terrible violence, the religious tolerance and the mass killings, the safe trade routes and the cities of ash. History is always like this: complex, contradictory, refusing to sort neatly into the categories we would prefer. We can hold the complexity. We can sit with it in the quiet night and let it be as complicated as it actually is. And yet, something remarkable came after the fire: the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. By the mid-13th century, after the initial phase of conquest was largely complete, the Mongol Empire had settled into something that surprised even some of its observers. It became, in the words of a French diplomat who travelled through it in the 1240s, a realm where a woman could walk from one end of the world to the other with a golden platter on her head and not be molested. This is hyperbole, of course, but it contains a real truth. Within the Mongol Empire, the roads were safer than they had been in living memory. The infrastructure of the Yam connected distant regions. The Yasa protected merchants, and the common authority of the Khan, enforced everywhere in every territory, with the same reliable brutality against those who broke it, provided a kind of order that transcended the patchwork of local politics that had previously made long-distance travel so dangerous. The results were extraordinary. Trade on the Silk Road reached heights that had not been seen since the height of the Roman and Han Chinese empires. Goods flowed in both directions: Chinese silk, porcelain, paper, and printing technology moving west, Middle Eastern glass, textiles, and mathematical knowledge moving east, European silver and wool and amber flowing in, spices from South and Southeast Asia coursing through the whole system. The exchange was not merely economic, it was intellectual. Medical practices moved along the roads as physicians accompanied caravans and armies. Agricultural plants crossed thousands of miles, carrots and lemons arriving in places that had never tasted them. Mathematical concepts and astronomical observations were shared across cultural boundaries that had previously been nearly impermeable. The plague also travelled these roads, the Black Death of the 14th century, which would kill perhaps a third of Europe's population, moved along the Mongol trade networks from its likely origin in Central Asia. This is one of the grimmer legacies of the connectivity the Mongols created. Connectivity, like most powerful things, works in multiple directions. The printing press that Gutenberg developed in Europe in the 1440s drew on Chinese printing technology that had been moving west along Mongol roads for 2 centuries. Paper money, invented in China and adopted throughout the Mongol Empire, was a concept that eventually reached Europe, transforming the nature of commerce and finance. These are not small things. These are among the defining technologies of modernity. And the direct genetic legacy of Genghis Khan is, by recent genetic research staggering. A 2003 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found evidence that approximately 16 million men alive at the time of the study, roughly 1 in 200 men on the planet, carried a Y chromosome that appeared to descend directly from a single male ancestor living in Mongolia around the time of Genghis Khan. The specific Y chromosome, with its distinctive pattern of markers, appears to have spread through the conquest of the Mongol Empire and the subsequent social advantage enjoyed by men descended from the Khan's line, who were given positions of power and access to resources across the empire. 16 million living descendants from one man on the steppe. One man who gripped a blood clot in his fist on the day he was born and spent his life clenching and unclenching that fist against the world. The Mongol Empire itself, after Genghis Khan's death, did not remain unified. His successors, his son Ogedei, who organized the Great Western Campaigns, his grandson Batu, who drove into Eastern Europe, another grandson, Hulagu, who conquered the Middle East, and the great Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. These men were formidable in their own rights, but they were many, and the empire was too vast to remain coherent under a single authority indefinitely. By the late 13th century it had divided into 4 successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe, each of which continued to exert enormous influence over its region for generations. The Golden Horde dominated Russia for 2.5 centuries. The Yuan dynasty was the richest and most sophisticated state in the world during Kublai Khan's reign. The Ilkhanate in Persia eventually converted to Islam and became a patron of Persian culture and learning. One of its rulers, Genghis Khan, commissioned histories and art that are among the treasures of medieval Islamic civilization. The legacy of Genghis Khan and his empire is still alive in the political geography and cultural memory of Eurasia. In Mongolia, he is the national hero. His face appears on the currency. The airport is named for him, and a massive equestrian statue of him overlooks the steppe near Ulaanbaatar, the largest equestrian statue in the world. In Russia, the memory of the Mongol period, called the Tatar-Yok in Russian historical tradition, still resonates in culture and politics. In China, the Yuan dynasty is simply one chapter in the long narrative of Chinese civilization, fully incorporated into the dynastic timeline. In Iran and Central Asia, the memory is more ambivalent. The destructions were real and lasting, but the cultural flowering of some Mongol successor states is also acknowledged. And in the field of strategy and organizational theory, Genghis Khan's methods are studied with genuine admiration by everyone from military academies to business schools. The decimal organization, the merit system, the intelligence-first approach to conflict, the scalable structure, the clear accountability. These principles appear again and again in the literature of management and strategy, recognized as having been articulated with extraordinary clarity on the Mongolian steppe 800 years ago. The fire is very low now. Just coals, glowing orange in the darkness, giving off a warmth that asks nothing of you but to be near it. The steppe is quiet. The stars are still. Somewhere out there in the dark the horses breathe. We have told the main story, but the night is long and there is much more to say. Let us settle in even more deeply, pull the furs a little closer, and let the stories continue to drift over us like the wind over the endless grass. In the history of the Mongol Empire, women occupy a position that is simultaneously more powerful than in most contemporary civilizations, and still deeply shaped by the constraints of a patriarchal nomadic world. It is a nuanced story, and it is one that deserves a long, slow telling. We have already met Holan, Temujin's mother. Let us linger with her a moment longer. After the abandonment by the clan following Yasuge's death, Holan raised 5 children essentially alone on the steppe. 5 children who would grow up to form the core of the inner circle around which the Mongol Empire was built. She did not break. She did not surrender. She foraged, fished, hunted, taught, organized, and kept the family alive through conditions that would have defeated most people. The secret history gives her a voice that is fierce and intelligent. In one scene, when Temujin and Kasar return after killing their half-brother Bekta, she does not simply grieve. She confronts them with an anger that is also grief, quoting old sayings, invoking ancient wisdom, demonstrating an understanding of the political and social consequences of what they have done that goes beyond maternal emotion into something more like statesmanship. Holan was given an honoured position in the imperial court throughout her life. She remained a significant presence even after Temujin became Genghis Khan. Her opinions were solicited and respected. Her household was large and well provisioned. She outlived several of her children. Borta, the first and senior wife of Genghis Khan, was another extraordinary figure. She was not merely a companion, she was a political partner. When Genghis Khan consulted about matters of succession, about the characters of his sons, about the wisdom or folly of specific decisions, Borta's voice was present. She's described as having been sharp-minded and perceptive. She outlived Temujin by several years and remained a figure of great respect and authority within the imperial family. But perhaps the most consequential woman in all of Mongol history, the woman without whom the empire might have collapsed in the generation after its greatest military successes, was Sorkaktani Beki. Sorkaktani was a Keret princess who became the wife of Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. Tolui was a formidable warrior but a troubled man, possibly an alcoholic, whose death in 1232 left Sorkaktani a widow with 4 young sons. These 4 sons would become the most powerful men in the Mongol world in the second half of the 13th century. Mongke, who became Great Khan, Kublai, who founded the Yuan dynasty in China, Hulagu, who conquered the Middle East and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, and Arikboke, who challenged Kublai for supremacy in the succession crisis after Mongke's death. 4 sons who each became Khan. In the largest empire in the world, this did not happen by accident. Sorkaktani raised these sons with extraordinary deliberateness. She was herself a Nestorian Christian. The Mongol world had a large population of Nestorian Christians, members of a branch of Christianity that had spread east across Central Asia centuries before the rise of Islam. But she understood the importance of each religion within the empire. She had Mongke educated by Islamic scholars. She enrolled Kublai in the Confucian tradition so that he would understand China. She ensured that all her sons understood the diverse world they would eventually rule. She administered her own territories, vast regions in northern China granted to her by the imperial family, with intelligence and compassion, protecting the agricultural population from the more destructive aspects of Mongol rule, encouraging tax policies that kept farmers on the land rather than driving them to flight. She was, in the words of the Persian historian Juvaini, who admired her greatly, an extremely clever woman in whose ability every monarch might take pride. When the great Khan Ogedei's court became increasingly dominated by factions and intrigue after his death, Sorkaktani navigated it with extraordinary skill, protecting her son's position through the reigns of 2 successors before finally engineering Mongke's elevation to the Great Khanship in 1251. She died shortly after, in 1252, having achieved everything she worked for. Her sons would go on to rule. The empire she'd kept alive in the dangerous decades of succession crisis would continue for another century. Without Sorkaktani Beki, it is genuinely possible that the Mongol Empire would have collapsed into civil war and fragmentation a generation earlier than it eventually did. She's one of the most underappreciated figures in world history, a woman operating in the background of enormous events, invisible to most narratives, but without whom those events would have turned out very differently. There were also the queens who ran things when the Khans were away at war, which was most of the time. Mongol queens, Hatuns, held real political authority over the territories assigned to them. They presided over courts, dispensed justice, managed correspondence, conducted diplomacy. The wives of senior Mongol officials had their own households, their own staff, their own sources of revenue. They were not dependents, they were administrators. This was partly a product of necessity. Men were away at war for years at a time, and someone had to manage things, and partly a product of Mongol cultural values that recognized women's intelligence and organizational ability in the domestic and herding sphere, and then simply extended those same qualities into the political sphere without making a dramatic philosophical distinction. The Mongol world was not a feminist paradise by any measure. Women were exchanged in marriage, taken in raids, made into secondary wives by men who already had primary wives, sometimes sold or given away. The violence of the conquest world fell on them with particular cruelty. These facts exist alongside the facts of female political power and must not be overlooked. But within those constraints, the women of the Mongol world carved out spaces of remarkable authority, and their contributions to the empire's building and survival were real and significant. Now let us return to the commanders, the men who turned Genghis Khan's strategic vision into physical reality across the vast distances of the campaigns. Subutai Batur, Subutai the Valiant, was born around 1175, probably the son of a blacksmith from the Uriankai people, a forest tribe of the northern forests bordering the steppe. He attached himself to Temujin at a young age with the remarkable declaration we mentioned earlier, the promise to be like a rat gathering food, to go wherever he was sent, even to the ends of the earth. He meant it. He kept the promise. Over the course of his career, Subutai commanded in more than 20 nations and won more than 65 pitched battles. He campaigned in China, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Korea, Persia, and across the entire breadth of the Mongol world. He developed the feigned retreat and the flanking ambush into art forms. He understood logistics, the supply chains and forage requirements of large cavalry forces, with a sophistication that was centuries ahead of his contemporaries. He understood reconnaissance and intelligence gathering as foundational rather than supplementary activities. His most famous campaign was the Great Western Expedition of 1241, conducted in conjunction with Batu Khan. This campaign drove from Mongolia all the way to the Adriatic Sea in a matter of months, defeating the armies of Poland at the Battle of Legnica and the armies of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi in the same week. Two separate forces, separated by nearly 300 miles, both completely destroyed within days of each other. The coordination required for this operation was staggering. Subutai was operating in territory he had personally scouted on his earlier expedition in 1221 to 1223. He had spent nearly 2 decades waiting, gathering intelligence, planning. When the campaign finally came, it unfolded with the precision of a mechanism. Contemporary European chronicles describe the Mongol invasion in terms of astonishment and terror. Commanders who faced the Mongol army and survived wrote of opponents who seemed to operate according to principles they could not understand, whose movements were impossible to predict, whose individual warriors were so skilled and so disciplined that engaging them directly was suicidal, and whose overall strategy seemed to be orchestrated by some invisible intelligence that was always several moves ahead. That invisible intelligence was Subutai. He died in 1248, a very old man for his time, having outlived most of his contemporaries. He died in his jur, which was reportedly a moving experience for those who knew him, the great warrior ending not in battle, but in the slow, quiet passage of the very old. Jebe, the arrow, was in some ways Subutai's opposite number in personality and style. Where Subutai was methodical and patient, a planner who thought in seasons and years, Jebe was famously fast, impetuous in the way of the greatest cavalry commanders, always seeking the decisive engagement, always driving forward. He could cover territory at speeds that seemed impossible to his enemies. It was Jebe and Subutai together who pursued Muhammad of Khwarezm across the dying empire, that extraordinary 3-year expedition that covered 8,000 miles and served as a reconnaissance of the Western world that the Mongols would eventually conquer. Jebe died on the return journey, somewhere in the east, perhaps of illness, perhaps of exhaustion. He was not yet 40. The partnership of these two men represented something important about the Mongol command structure, the willingness to give brilliant subordinates enormous autonomy. Genghis Khan did not micromanage his generals. He gave them objectives: find Muhammad, assess the Western territories, defeat the Russian princes, and then trusted them to accomplish those objectives by whatever means they judged best. This was possible only because of the tight selection and training system that produced officers of genuine quality, men who could be trusted with independent command because they had internalized not just orders, but the Khan's strategic thinking. Jebe and Subutai operated 3,000 miles from the nearest Mongol force, making decisions that shaped the fate of nations, without the ability to receive orders more than once every several months. They were trusted, and they were worthy of that trust. We have referenced this document many times tonight. It deserves its own moment in the firelight. The Secret History of the Mongols, in Mongolian, the Mongolun Nyukhatobchian, is one of the most remarkable texts to survive from the medieval world. It was written sometime around 1227, the year of Genghis Khan's death, or possibly later in the 13th century, by authors unknown. Its name refers to the fact that it was apparently kept within the Mongol ruling family, not intended for outside eyes. Secret in the sense of private or reserved, not secret in the sense of hidden conspiracy. The text was written in a form of Mongolian that was transcribed into Chinese characters for phonetic purposes at some point, which is how it survived, as a Chinese phonetic text of a Mongolian oral composition, essentially. This is a remarkable chain of transmission, each link of which is improbable, and the fact that it survived at all is something of a miracle. What the text gives us is irreplaceable, a Mongol perspective on events told from inside the tradition, in a voice that is sometimes lyrical and sometimes blunt and sometimes darkly funny, and sometimes moving in ways that are difficult to articulate. It tells the story of Temujin's life and the founding of the empire not as outsiders saw it, not as Persian or Chinese or European chroniclers observed it from a distance, but as the Mongols themselves remembered it. The text has a distinctive quality of reported speech. It gives us dialogue, actual sentences that people are said to have spoken. in a tradition that goes back to the oral performance from which it derived. Whether these words were actually spoken as written is unknowable, but they feel true in the way oral history feels true, not as a court transcript but as a distillation of remembered character, the kind of thing this person would have said, the kind of words that capture who they were. Scholars have argued about its historical reliability for a century. Some sections are clearly legendary. Some are demonstrably accurate when checked against other sources. Most are somewhere in between, shaped by memory and politics and the need to legitimize the ruling dynasty, but rooted in genuine historical events and real people. For the night listener, for the person drifting towards sleep in the quiet, the secret history offers something that the scholarly argument cannot touch. The sound of the Mongol world, the texture of it, the feeling of sitting around a fire and hearing a story told in a language from the great grass ocean of the steppe. It is the voice of a world that has otherwise mostly fallen silent, speaking across 8 centuries to wherever you are tonight, comfortable and warm and growing gently heavy. We touched on the yam earlier in our discussion of organizational genius. Let us dwell here more fully, because the yam is one of those innovations that reveals, in a single system, the full scope of what the Mongol Empire was trying to accomplish. To maintain a postal relay system across 24 million square kilometers requires, first, a very clear vision of what communication means to an empire. It requires the understanding that information, the flow of orders, reports, intelligence, and official correspondence, is not a luxury, but the circulatory system of governance. Without it, the center cannot know what is happening at the periphery. Without it, commands issued in Karakoram cannot reach Mongolia's furthest territories in time to be useful. Without it, the empire is not one thing but many things, gradually drifting apart. Genghis Khan understood this intuitively. The yam, the relay station system, was probably developed in its basic form early in the empire, refined over the decades of expansion as new territories were added. By the time of Kublai Khan, the system encompassed something in the range of 10,000 stations, covering not just the Mongolian heartland, but the routes through China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Russian steppe. At each station there were horses. The number varied depending on the importance of the route, but a major station might have dozens. There were riders ready to go at any hour. There was food for travellers. There were officials who checked credentials and logged the passage of messages and goods. The whole system was coordinated from the centre, its stations established by imperial order, its resources funded by the taxation of local populations. A message from Kublai Khan's court in Kanbalik, the great capital of the Yuan dynasty, roughly where modern Beijing stands, could reach the other end of the empire in days to weeks rather than months. This was not just impressive, it was transformative. It meant that the Khan could actually govern the empire in real time, responding to events before they had time to spiral out of control. It meant that generals in the field could receive updated orders and intelligence. It meant that merchants could send letters ahead of their goods, establishing business relationships across distances that would otherwise make commerce impossibly risky. Marco Polo, who travelled through the empire in the late 13th century and served at Kublai Khan's court for many years, was astonished by the yam and described it in his famous account with the enthusiasm of a man who had never seen anything like it. He was right to be astonished. The closest equivalent in the Western world at that time was the Roman cursus publicus, the imperial post of Rome. But that system had collapsed with the Western Roman Empire and would not be reconstructed in Europe until centuries later. The Mongol yam was in its 13th century form the most sophisticated postal and communication system in the world. We have noted the policy of religious tolerance embedded in the Yasa, but the Mongol engagement with religion and knowledge went beyond mere tolerance into something more active, more curious, more intellectually alive. Genghis Khan himself was, as we have said, a practitioner of the traditional Mongolian shamanic religion. He prayed to Tengri, the eternal blue sky. He consulted shamans. He gave particular veneration to mountains, rivers, and the sacred landscape of the steppe. But he was also genuinely curious about other religious traditions, and he held discussions with religious figures of many faiths. The most famous of these encounters was with the Taoist master Qiu Chuji, also known as Changchun, who travelled from China to meet with Genghis Khan somewhere in Central Asia around 1221 to 1222, a journey of several thousand miles that the old master undertook at the Khan's personal invitation. Genghis Khan asked Changchun about the secret of immortality. The Taoist master answered, with admirable honesty, that he had no secret of immortality, only the wisdom that long life came from virtue and moderation and care for one's health. Genghis Khan reportedly appreciated this honest answer more than he might have appreciated a false promise. He gave Changchun great honour, exempted Taoist clergy from taxation, and sent him back to China with a decree of protection for the Taoist religious community. This pattern repeated with other religious traditions. Nestorian Christian clergy, Buddhist monks, Muslim ulama, Jewish scholars, all found that the Mongol Empire was, within limits, willing to engage with their traditions, to debate religious questions, to grant protections and exemptions, to incorporate their learning into the imperial project. Kublai Khan, later in the century, was famous for holding multi-faith religious debates at his court, sessions where representatives of different traditions argued for their beliefs before the Khan and his court. These debates were not always entirely respectful by modern standards, and the political stakes of religious patronage sometimes made them more competitive than genuine. But they represented something real, a ruling tradition that was genuinely curious about the diversity of human religious and intellectual life. The Mongol Empire was also a vehicle for the transfer of specific bodies of knowledge that had profound long-term consequences. Chinese astronomical observations and mathematical techniques moved west through the Mongol networks and influenced Islamic astronomy, which in turn influenced European astronomy. Persian medical knowledge, preserved and developed in the great medical schools of the Islamic world, moved east into China, where it contributed to the development of Chinese medical practice. Agricultural plants moved in all directions. The transfer of knowledge is, of course, a more delicate and uncertain process than the transfer of goods. Ideas do not simply travel in caravans. They need people who carry them, teachers who can transmit them, students who can receive and adapt them. But the Mongol Empire created the conditions in which such people could move. The safe roads, the common administrative language, the culture of curiosity at the top of the hierarchy that gave permission for inquiry and exchange throughout the system. The story does not end in 1227. It continues, richly and sometimes tragically, through the lives of Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons, each of whom inherited a portion of an empire too vast for any single person to govern and tried, with varying degrees of success and failure to hold it together. Ojade, the third son and designated successor, was in many ways the ideal continuation of his father's project. He was less militarily brilliant than some of his brothers, less ferocious than Chagatai, less strategically gifted than the commanders who served under him, but he had qualities his father had recognized as more important for an emperor than for a general: political acumen, the ability to listen, the willingness to build consensus among the often competing interests of the vast extended family of Borjigin princes who now ruled different parts of the empire. Under Ogedei, the empire reached its greatest military extent. The western campaigns of Batu and Subutai drove into Europe. The eastern campaigns finally ended the Jin dynasty. The Yam was expanded and regularized. The capital of Karakoram was built, a proper city, modest by Chinese or Persian standards, but a genuine urban centre, complete with palaces, temples, markets, and the diplomatic embassies of a dozen different kingdoms. Ogedei also had a significant weakness: he drank too much. The erag of the steppe and the wine of the conquered regions flowed freely at the Mongol court, and Ogedei drank more than was good for him. His advisors worried about it. Chagatai, his older brother and perpetual critic, was said to have had a man stationed beside Ogedei at banquets to count his cups and limit his intake. It did not work. Ogedei died in 1241, a relatively young man, of what the sources indicate was alcohol-related illness. His death created a succession crisis that had direct consequences on a world stage. The Mongol army in Europe, Batu and Subutai's force that had just annihilated the Hungarian army and was poised to drive further west, perhaps into Germany, perhaps to the Atlantic, turned around and came home. The Mongol Empire had a custom. All major nobles and commanders had to return to participate in the Kurultai, the assembly that would choose the new Khan. The invasion of Western Europe was over. The subsequent decades of succession crisis, the rule of Ogedei's alcoholic son Guyuk, who died after only 2 years, the regency of Toregin Khatun, Ogedei's remarkable wife, who held things together while manoeuvring for her son's succession, the eventual election of Monkey through the political genius of Sorkaktani Beki. These decades were not idle. The empire continued to function, to trade, to administer. But the political energy of the court was consumed by internal competition, and the great expansion paused. Under Monkey, the empire surged again. Hulagu's campaign in the Middle East destroyed the assassin sect, the notorious order of the Ismaili Hashashin who had terrorized rulers across the Islamic world for a century, and then swept on to Baghdad, where in 1258 the Abbasid Caliphate was ended. The last caliph, al-Mustasim, was wrapped in felt and trampled by horses. The Mongol method of killing a man of noble birth without spilling his blood on the earth. The city that had been the cultural capital of the Islamic world for 5 centuries burned for a week, but the westward push was checked. At Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260, a Mongol force was defeated by the Egyptian Mamluks, the first significant Mongol defeat in a pitched battle in the Western theatre. The Mamluks were themselves a warrior slave caste with roots in the steppe, trained in horseback fighting, skilled in the same kinds of mounted archery that the Mongols used. They knew how to fight the Mongol way because, in some sense, they were products of the same cultural tradition. And Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, a small valley in what is now Israel, became the high water mark of Mongol expansion in the Middle East. Kublai Khan completed the conquest of southern China, the Song dynasty, which had held out in the south while the Mongols overran the north, and declared himself emperor of the Yuan dynasty in 1271. He built his great capital Khanbalik, later called Dadu, roughly where Beijing stands today, and created perhaps the most sophisticated court in the world. Marco Polo arrived in the early 1270s and spent 17 years in Kublai's service. His descriptions of the court, the cities, the trade networks, the wealth, the diversity. These descriptions seemed so fantastical to European readers that many refused to believe them. They were by and large true. Kublai's China was, in the late 13th century, the most populous, most economically productive, most technologically sophisticated state in the world. The Grand Canal was extended. Paper money was issued in quantities that would eventually cause inflation, but in the short term massively stimulated trade. The population was immense. The cities were larger than anything in Europe. Hangzhou, which Kublai had conquered and which Marco Polo visited, had a population perhaps larger than any European city of the era. But Kublai's attempts to extend further, to Japan, to Vietnam, to Java, failed. The naval campaigns against Japan in 1274 and 1281 were destroyed by typhoons, the divine winds, the kamikaze, that the Japanese would remember for centuries. The jungle warfare of Vietnam and the maritime distances of Java were beyond the Mongol cavalry-centered military system. There were limits. The empire fragmented. The four successor states, Yuan, Ilkhanate, Chagatai, Golden Horde, diverged. They sometimes fought each other. They developed their own distinct characters. The Ilkhanate in Persia became a patron of Persian culture, converted to Islam, and eventually produced some of the most beautiful manuscript painting and architecture of the medieval Islamic world. The Golden Horde in Russia became an Islamic state that dominated Russian politics and culture for 2.5 centuries. Its influence on Russian political culture, on the centralized autocratic tradition of the Russian state, has been debated by historians ever since. The Yuan dynasty in China lasted until 1368, when a peasant rebellion led by Zhu Yuanzhang drove the Mongols back to the steppe and founded the Ming dynasty. The Golden Horde gradually lost its power to the rising Russian state of Moscow during the 15th century. The Chagatai Khanate persisted in various forms until the 17th century. The last significant successor state, the Timurid Empire, founded by Timur the Lame, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and certainly ruled in the Mongol tradition, produced some of the most magnificent architecture and scholarship of the 15th century in Samarkand and Herat, before collapsing in the early 16th century. Let us rest now in the quieter channels of this story. Let us walk the roads. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a network, a web of routes that connected China, Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, and eventually the Mediterranean world, along which goods and ideas had been moving for centuries before Genghis Khan was born. But the Silk Road under the Mongol Empire was different in kind from what it had been before. It was, for perhaps the first time in history, a truly safe network, patrolled, maintained, legally protected, furnished with regular rest stations and reliable currency, and the common authority of the Mongol legal system. Picture, if you will, a caravan setting out from Kanbalik, from Kublai's great capital, in the early morning. The air is cold and smells of frost and horse. The camels, 2-humped Bactrian camels, the ideal animals for the Central Asian routes, are being loaded in the grey pre-dawn light, their loads secured with practiced efficiency by handlers who've done this hundreds of times. The merchant in charge is perhaps a Muslim from Persia, part of the Ortog system that Genghis Khan had established, a kind of imperial trade partnership in which the Khan provided capital and the Muslim merchants provided expertise and networks, sharing profits and losses. The caravan moves out of the city gates as the sun rises, joining others on the same road, merging into a slow-moving river of commerce that will flow westward across the Mongolian plateau, across the Gobi, through the oases of Dunhuang and Kashgar, across the high passes of the Pamirs, down into the valleys of Fergana and Samarkand, through the Persian heartland, and eventually to the ports of the Persian Gulf or the Black Sea. At each yam station along the route, the merchant presents his pisa, his official travel document, his passport in the imperial system, and receives fresh information about the road conditions ahead, the availability of water and fodder, any security concerns. He can change animals. He can leave letters that will be forwarded east or west by the relay riders. He can receive medical care if needed, or simply rest and eat before continuing. The goods in the caravan are a museum of the connected world. Chinese silk, of course, the fine and famous silk that had given the road its name, packed in compressed bales that would travel 15,000 miles before reaching a European noblewoman's wardrobe. Chinese porcelain, equally famous, wrapped carefully against breakage, each piece worth more in Europe than its weight in silver. Spices from Southeast Asia, arriving in China from maritime routes and now continuing overland. Indian cotton textiles, Persian metalwork, the finest brass and bronze work of the medieval world. Central Asian lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone that could not be found elsewhere, that painters across the medieval world crushed into pigment for the blue robes of the Virgin Mary and the deep skies of Byzantine mosaics, and carried along with the goods, often invisibly, were the ideas. The physicians who travelled with the caravans shared their knowledge with colleagues in other cities. The scholars who accompanied diplomatic missions read books they had never encountered and carried descriptions of new texts back to their own libraries. The craftsmen who were relocated by Mongol decree from one part of the empire to another brought their techniques with them and adapted them to new materials and new demands. The Pax Mongolica lasted for roughly a century, from the completion of the conquest in the mid-13th century to the disruptions of the Black Death and the internal fragmentation of the empire in the mid-14th century. 100 years. It is not a long time in the sweep of history, but in that century, the movement of people, goods, and ideas across Eurasia reached levels that would not be exceeded until the era of European maritime exploration, and arguably until the modern era of containerized shipping and the internet. We have spoken of the Mongol horse as a military asset, but the horse in Mongol culture was more than an instrument of war. It was, in many ways, the central element around which all of Mongol life was organized, economically, socially, spiritually. A Mongol family's wealth was measured in horses. A rich man had many horses, hundreds in the case of the great nobles, thousands in the case of the Khan and his family. A poor man had few. The horse was the unit of value, the indicator of status, the gift of choice in diplomatic and personal relationships. To give someone a fine horse was to honour them. To receive one was to accept a bond of obligation and respect. The mares were milked, a practice that seems strange to those outside the tradition, but makes perfect nutritional sense in the context of the steppe, where cattle were less numerous and the horse population was immense. A mare in good condition can produce several litres of milk per day during the lactation period. This milk fermented in large leather sacks. The churning of the sacks was a daily task, the stirring and movement of the family's travel, helping to ferment the milk naturally, became airag, the fundamental beverage of the steppe. Mildly intoxicating, rich in vitamins and protein, suitable for both children and adults. The spiritual relationship with the horse was equally profound. In Mongol shamanic tradition, certain horses were sacred, reserved for ritual purposes, never ridden for ordinary work, sometimes sacrificed at the death of great men. The horsehead fiddle, the morinkhur, was itself said to have been created in memory of a beloved horse. The legend goes that a young man's horse died, and he made an instrument from its skull and hair to preserve its spirit in music. Genghis Khan himself had a particular relationship with a grey horse, some sources say a white horse, that he rode on campaigns and that he prayed to as a kind of intermediary with the divine. The sacred horse was an element of Mongol royal ritual that persisted through the empire's history. After a great battle, the finest enemy horses were not simply seized and put to work. They were evaluated, selected, trained, and integrated into the Mongol remount system with care. The genetic improvement of the Mongolian horse stock over the course of the empire's expansion was a real and intentional process. The Mongols were sophisticated breeders who understood the value of good bloodlines. One aspect of Mongol military training that is often overlooked is the hunt. Not ordinary hunting for food, though that was done, but the great organised hunt called the Nerj, which was essentially a military exercise disguised as a sporting event. The Nerj worked like this. A vast circle of horsemen would be established around a large area of steppe or forest, the circle perhaps 100 miles in circumference at the start. The line of riders would then begin to contract, driving all the animals within the circle inward. The circle tightened over days, the riders maintaining the line, preventing any animal from breaking through, the noise and pressure of the riders gradually concentrating the prey: wolves, bears, deer, gazelle, wild horses, wild boar, whatever lived in the enclosed area, into an ever smaller space. When the circle was tight enough, when the animals were packed together, terrified, unable to escape, the Khan entered first and was given the first kill, then the nobles, in order of rank, then the warriors. The hunt could last for days. The circle maintained as prey was killed in the centre. The process was systematic and thorough and violent. The Nerj was military training in several senses. It required the same kind of coordinated movement over vast distances, maintaining a line, communicating positions, responding to signals, that a battle did. It required individual discipline, the ability to hold position even when the pressure to advance was enormous, and it gave every warrior experience in controlled large-scale manoeuvre. The feigned retreat of the battlefield was, in some ways, a direct application of the Nerj's technique, drawing a prey animal, or an enemy, toward a point of your choosing through controlled movement, then closing the circle. The great generals were also great hunters. Subutai and Jebe learned to read terrain, to calculate movement, to coordinate over distance, in the Nerj as much as in the battle. We have mentioned the Mongol intelligence system briefly. Let us develop it more fully, because it was genuinely one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the medieval world. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan and his commanders spent months or years gathering information. The primary sources of this information were merchants, who travelled freely through even potentially hostile territories and observed everything without appearing to be military agents, and dedicated intelligence operatives who were assigned to specific missions. These operatives were, in modern terms, a combination of diplomatic agents and spies. They travelled in the guise of merchants or holy men or simple travellers. They spoke the languages of the target regions. The Mongol Empire had access to speakers of dozens of languages among its diverse population. They cultivated relationships with officials and informants in the target state, gathering information about internal politics, economic conditions, military strength, and the personalities of key leaders. The information was then transmitted back through the YAM system, accumulated, analysed, probably by a small group of advisors close to the Khan, and used to shape the campaign plan. This intelligence-first approach is perhaps most clearly visible in the Khwarezmian campaign. Genghis Khan knew before he attacked that there was significant tension between Shah Muhammad and his mother Turkan Khatun. He knew the geographic layout of the empire's defences. He knew the political relationships between the major cities. He knew which commanders were loyal to the Shah and which were merely performing loyalty. This knowledge shaped his campaign. Rather than attacking on a single front, he used multiple converging columns that prevented the Shah from massing his forces and that threatened the internal political unity of the empire along its existing fault lines. The Shah's decision to disperse his forces and defend the cities individually, rather than concentrating and fighting in the open, played directly into Mongol hands. But this decision was not accidental from the Mongol perspective. The intelligence they had gathered suggested that the Shah did not trust his commanders enough to let them operate independently, and that his strategy would be defensive and city-based. The Mongol campaign was designed to exploit exactly this defensive posture. The Mongols developed a sophisticated system of diplomatic communication that coexisted with, and often prefaced, their military operations. The universal protection of ambassadors was enshrined in the Yasa. To kill an ambassador was one of the gravest possible violations of Mongol law. This was not merely an ethical position, it was a practical one. The Mongol Empire communicated constantly with the states around it, and ambassadors were the primary channel of that communication. To violate their safety would be to cut off intelligence, to invite retaliation, and to delegitimize the entire diplomatic system. This is what made the murder of Genghis Khan's merchants and the killing of his ambassador by the Khwarezmian Shah so particularly outrageous from the Mongol perspective. It was not merely an insult, it was a fundamental violation of the rules by which the international system operated, and it demanded, in Mongol understanding, a proportionate response. The Mongols sent diplomatic missions to states they had no immediate plans to attack, gathering information, establishing relationships, sometimes demanding formal submission in advance of any military action. The letters they sent to European rulers in the mid-13th century, preserved in the Vatican archives and in various European chronicles, are remarkable documents, direct, imperious, theologically confident, demanding submission in the name of the God-given authority of the great Khan, and making clear the consequences of refusal. European rulers who received these letters were understandably shocked and confused. They had no framework for understanding what the Mongols were, where they had come from, or whether the demands they made were serious. Some assumed the Mongols were the armies of Prester John, a legendary Christian king of the East whose coming was anticipated in certain medieval European prophecies. Some dismissed the letters as the ravings of barbarians. None of them submitted. The Mongols took note. The Western campaigns that followed were not random raids. They were, in part, the consequence of diplomacy ignored. And now, as the night deepens and the fire burns very low, let us do what historians love to do at the end of a long story. Draw the lines forward, trace the influence to the present. The principles of Genghis Khan's organizational and military system are studied today in military academies, in business schools, and in organizational theory in ways that would have been impossible to predict in the 13th century. Let us trace some of these connections gently without overstating them. The decimal organizational structure, with its clean lines of authority, its defined spans of control, and its modular scalability, reappears in the organizational structures of modern armies and corporations. The principle that every person has exactly one direct supervisor, the unity of command doctrine, is a cornerstone of both military and civilian management theory. Genghis Khan did not invent this principle, but he implemented it with a consistency and discipline that produced results that organizational theorists still find instructive. The merit principle, promotion and reward based on demonstrated ability rather than hereditary status, is now so fundamental to modern organizational thinking that it seems obvious. But it was not obvious in the 13th century. In a world where virtually every political, religious, and military institution based advancement on birth, family, and social connection, the Mongol system's insistence on demonstrated performance was genuinely radical. The West did not decisively shift in this direction until the 19th century, with civil service reform movements in Britain and the United States. The intelligence-first approach, gathering comprehensive information before acting, treating reconnaissance as foundational rather than supplementary, is a cornerstone of modern military planning, and also, in the form of market research and competitive intelligence, of modern business strategy. The principle that you should know your environment thoroughly before committing resources is so deeply embedded in modern strategic thinking that we barely notice it as a principle at all. Genghis Khan made it into a system. The communication and logistics infrastructure, the YAM, anticipates the modern insight that information systems and supply chains are not support functions but core strategic assets. Armies and organizations that can communicate faster and supply themselves more reliably than their competitors have a decisive advantage. The YAM was the 13th century version of this insight, implemented at a scale and sophistication that would not be equalled until the modern era. The treatment of conquered peoples, integration rather than destruction, incorporating rather than eliminating, reflects what modern political scientists call legitimacy management. The recognition that a governing authority that serves the basic interests of its subjects is more stable and more durable than one that simply extracts from them. Genghis Khan's empire was not universally benevolent. It was often brutal. But within its brutality was a pragmatic wisdom about the conditions of stable governance that modern states continue to grapple with, and perhaps the deepest lesson, the one that historians and strategists return to most often, the willingness to be genuinely heterodox, to question the assumptions of one's own tradition, to adopt ideas from wherever they come, Chinese engineering, Uyghur script, Persian administration, Islamic mathematics, without the insecurity that would have led other rulers to reject foreign knowledge as a threat to cultural identity. Genghis Khan borrowed everything that worked. He had no ideological attachment to any particular way of doing things, no pride of tradition that would have prevented him from learning from those he'd conquered. He was, in this sense, one of the great pragmatists of history, a man who cared entirely about results and not at all about the source of the ideas that produced them. This is perhaps the most dangerous lesson to draw from his life. Dangerous because it can be used to justify anything, but it is also, if held carefully and ethically, one of the most powerful. The willingness to learn from every source, to adopt what works without prejudice, to remain intellectually open to ideas that come from outside one's own tradition. This is a principle that stands independent of the violence in which Genghis Khan embodied it. There is a story in the secret history that we have not yet told. A small story, a quiet one, from the early years. Temujin, during one of the many periods of danger that characterized his youth, was being hunted. By whom, the sources vary. Perhaps the Taichiud, perhaps some other rival group. He was riding through the steppe at night, alone or nearly alone, trying to put distance between himself and his pursuers. He came to a valley, and in the valley there was a man. Just a man, a stranger, with a fire going. The man looked at Temujin, probably young, maybe 16 or 17, ragged, clearly riding hard, and did not ask questions. He gave him food, he told him to rest, he let him sleep by the fire. In the morning, when Temujin rode on, he carried with him something that went beyond the food and the rest. He carried the knowledge that generosity existed in the world, that strangers could be kind, that there were people who helped without asking why. The secret history tells us that Temujin never forgot a kindness. He also never forgot a betrayal. Both these memories were active forces in his psychology, shaping his decisions, informing his choices about who to trust, who to elevate, who to punish, who to forgive. This is, I think, the most human thing about the story of Genghis Khan. Not the battles, not the empires, not the organizational charts and the intelligence systems, but the boy by the fire in the valley, grateful for a stranger's warmth, carrying that gratitude forward for the rest of his life. Building an empire, at least partly, out of the need to make a world where that kind of kindness was not random luck, but something more reliable, where the roads were safe, where strangers could be kind to strangers without fear, where the laws protected the traveller. He did not entirely succeed. No one entirely succeeds at making the world safe, but the attempt, the vision of a world organized, protected, communicating, moving, was real, and it shaped the world. One of the most dramatic episodes in the Mongol campaigns against the West was the destruction of the Ismaili assassin sect, the Hashashin, under Hulagu Khan in 1256. The Hashashin were a branch of Ismaili Shia Islam, who had for roughly 2 centuries operated from a series of mountain fortresses in what is now northern Iran and Syria. Their leader was known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a title that had passed through several generations of the Ismaili imamate. Their specialty was political assassination. They trained devoted operatives who would kill specific targets, rulers, generals, religious figures, on command, regardless of the security surrounding the target, regardless of the risk to themselves. For a century and a half, the Hashashin had terrorized the rulers of the Islamic world. Caliphs, sultans, and generals lived in fear of a knock at the door, of a stranger in a crowd, of the quiet man who served as a servant and one day produced a knife. The fortress of Alamut, the eagle's nest, in the Alborz Mountains was their headquarters, a virtually impregnable position on a narrow rock, accessible only by a single path, stocked with supplies that could last for years. The Mongols destroyed them utterly. Hulagu, with Möngke Khan's blessing and careful logistical support, moved against Alamut in 1256. The fortress and its outlying castles fell after determined sieges. The last imam, Rukn ad-Din Khursha, negotiated a surrender and then travelled to Möngke Khan's court to seek clemency. He was killed on the return journey, probably on Möngke's orders. The Syrian branch of the Hashashin survived for another few decades before being destroyed by the Mamluks, who had no more patience for assassins than the Mongols had. The destruction of the assassin order was greeted with relief across much of the Islamic world. Even Muslim rulers who feared the Mongols were glad to be free of the Hashashin's particular brand of terror. It was one of the clearest cases where the Mongol conquest removed something that the affected civilization considered a genuine menace. The rhythm of Mongol imperial life was organized around a series of regular ceremonies and rituals that reinforced the hierarchies of the empire while also providing genuine spiritual meaning to the participants. The most important of these ceremonies involved kumis, fermented mare's milk, the erug we have mentioned. At the height of the imperial power, the Khan's court observed a yearly cycle of great festivals in which kumis played a central ritual role. The milk was gathered from mares at specific seasons, fermented in great leather bags, and then distributed in a hierarchy of cups, the Khan first, then the senior princes, then the nobles, then the commanders, then the people. These ceremonies were not merely social events. They were rituals of renewal, of the reaffirmation of bonds between the Khan and his people, of the acknowledgement that the Khan's authority was both sacred, from Tengri, and contractual, sustained by the loyalty of the people. The distribution of kumis was a kind of communion, not in the Christian theological sense, but in the sense of shared participation in something that held the community together. The great seasonal celebrations also involved the nurge, the hunt that we've already described, as well as shamanic ceremonies, the offering of libations to the spirits of the land and the ancestors, the recitation of genealogies, and the formal acknowledgement of rank and precedence within the imperial family. These rituals gave structure to time and meaning to position. They reminded everyone, from the greatest prince to the humblest warrior, of their place in the vast web of obligation and loyalty that was the empire. They were the cultural glue that held together a political structure that was, in purely rational terms, almost impossibly complex. In the 1230s and 1240s, the Mongol Empire built itself a capital. Karakorum, in Mongolian, roughly black stones, was established in the Orkhon Valley, in the heart of the Mongolian plateau, near rivers and good pasture. It was not a large city by the standards of Beijing or Samarkand or Baghdad. It was, at its peak, perhaps a mile and a half across, a modest urban centre surrounded by the vast felt tent encampments of the nomadic court. But it was remarkable in its own way. William of Rubruck, a Flemish friar sent by King Louis IX of France on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court in 1253 to 1254, visited Karakorum and left one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of the city in its prime. He describes a city with two major neighbourhoods, a Muslim quarter and a Chinese quarter, and 12 different temples representing as many religious traditions, plus 2 mosques and a Nestorian Christian church. The market was stocked with goods from across the empire. The artisans practiced trades from a dozen different civilizations. At the centre of the Khan's palace, Rubruck describes a remarkable mechanical fountain. It was built by a French craftsman named Guillaume Bouchy, a Parisian, somehow ending up in the heart of Mongolia in the 1250s, because the Mongol Empire had ways of acquiring skilled craftsmen from conquered territories. The fountain had 4 pipes in the shape of serpents, and when the Khan's butler signalled, wine or arag or honey mead would flow from each pipe into silver cups below, served to the great men of the court. This fountain is one of the most charming details in the entire history of the Mongol Empire. This small piece of Paris engineering, operating in a felt tent in the middle of the Mongolian plateau, pouring wine at the command of the great Khan. It captures something essential about what the Mongol Empire was. Not a single culture, but a confluence of cultures, a gathering point for the knowledge and craft and creativity of half the world, however violently that gathering had been accomplished. Karakorum was abandoned as the imperial capital when Kublai Khan moved the court to China in the 1260s. It declined. Eventually it was destroyed. The great Buddhist monastery of Erdenizu was built from its stones in the 16th century, and today the ruins of the monastery and some foundations from the original city can be visited in the Orkhon Valley, in the quiet of the central Mongolian steppe. The grass has grown back, the horses graze, the wind moves through the foundations of the fountain, and there is no sound of wine flowing. In Chinese political culture, emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven, the idea that the right to rule was granted by heaven and could be withdrawn if the ruler failed to govern justly. Genghis Khan's own understanding of his authority was different but structurally analogous. He ruled by the mandate of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, who had chosen him to unify the peoples of the world under a single law and a single authority. This theological claim was not merely self-serving rhetoric, though it was certainly that as well. It was a genuine belief, or at least an expression of a genuine cultural framework that shaped how Genghis Khan understood his own mission. He was not simply a conqueror. He was, in his own understanding and in the understanding of those who followed him, an agent of cosmic order. The world was meant to be unified. The fragmentation of peoples and kingdoms was an error that his mission was to correct. This belief gave his enterprise a kind of moral authority within the Mongol framework that pure conquest could not. It made resistance not just politically defiant but theologically incorrect. And it made the empire not just a collection of conquered territories but a vision of universal order. Whether you find this vision admirable, horrifying, or simply interesting depends on where you sit in relation to history's longest shadow. But understanding that this was the frame within which Genghis Khan operated, that he genuinely believed himself to be fulfilling a divine mission rather than simply pursuing personal ambition, is essential to understanding why his enterprise had the energy and coherence it did. A man who believes he's doing the right thing, the necessary thing, the thing he was put on earth to do, such a man is both more powerful and more dangerous than a man who is merely ambitious. The Mongol language and the written word. Before Genghis Khan unified the steppe, the Mongolian language had no writing system. This is not because the Mongols were without sophistication. Their oral tradition, as we've explored, was extraordinarily rich and complex, but writing had not been part of their world. The need for written records, for laws written down rather than recited from memory, for administrative documents and diplomatic correspondence, arrived with the empire. The solution Genghis Khan adopted was elegant and practical. He captured a Uyghur scholar named Tata Tonga, who had been the seal keeper of the Naiman king. Tata Tonga was literate in the Uyghur script, a flowing vertical alphabet adapted originally from Sogdian script, which had itself derived from the great family of alphabets that trace back to Phoenician. Genghis Khan set Tata Tonga to work teaching the Mongolian princes and nobles to read and write using this script, adapting it for the sounds of the Mongolian language. This Uyghur-derived Mongolian script is the one in which the secret history was eventually written. It is the ancestor of the traditional Mongolian script still used in Inner Mongolia today. That beautiful vertical flowing script that runs from top to bottom and left to right, unlike virtually any other writing system in the world, giving Mongolian text an appearance as unique as the culture it records. The introduction of illiteracy into Mongolian life had consequences that rippled through everything. Laws could be written down and distributed. Orders could be sent in writing rather than relying on messengers' memory. Records of census, taxation, and trade could be maintained. The empire's administrative life became increasingly dependent on the written word, and the literate specialists, the Uyghur clerks, and eventually the Mongolian-speaking administrators they trained, became some of the most valued members of the imperial court. Genghis Khan himself, by most accounts, never learned to read. He was a man of the oral tradition, and the demands of his life had never allowed for the kind of patient sitting with text that literacy required. But he understood its value immediately and institutionalized it without hesitation. This is characteristic. He did not need to personally master a skill to recognize its worth and incorporate it into his system. Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself imagine a night on the Silk Road during the height of the Pax Mongolica, somewhere in the middle of what is now Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. The year is perhaps 1270. The caravanserai, the roadside inn, a building of mud brick with thick walls against the heat of the day and the cold of the night, is full tonight. There is a fire in the central courtyard, and around it sit men and women from half the world. A Chinese merchant who has been travelling for 4 months and is still 2 months from his destination. A Venetian trader who cannot quite believe he has come this far and is still alive and unmolested. A Mongol postal rider resting before the next stage of his relay. A Persian doctor travelling to the court of the Ilkhan in Tabriz. A Buddhist monk from Tibet heading west to see the holy places of Islam, because in the empire's curious atmosphere of interfaith curiosity, such things were possible. A Georgian noblewoman, Christian, travelling to her family's estates in the Caucasus under a Mongol safe conduct pass. None of them speak the same language natively, but between them they manage. Persian is the lingua franca of the Western Silk Road. Mongolian carries authority everywhere. Chinese merchants often speak enough Persian and enough Mongolian to manage. The Venetian has picked up some Mongol during his months of travel, enough to buy food and ask directions. They eat together, bread baked in the caravanserai's clay oven, stewed mutton, dried fruits from Samarkand, tea from China. They share information, road conditions ahead, whether water sources are reliable, which officials are demanding bribes. They trade, informally, here in the courtyard. The Chinese merchant has small quantities of silk and lacquerware. The Persian doctor has a case of valuable medicines. The Venetian has silver coins that buy well at almost any market. Above them, the stars are extraordinary. Out here, far from any city, the sky is black velvet and the Milky Way is a river of light. The same sky that Genghis Khan called father, the same sky under which he had prayed before battles and given thanks after victories, the same sky under which his mother had foraged along the river bank to feed her children. One by one, the travellers in the caravanserai drift asleep. The fire dies down. The camels are quiet in their paddock. The night is still. The roads are safe. The empire breathes. And somewhere, out in the darkness, a Mongol postal rider is already moving, carrying the empire's messages through the night at a gallop, the hooves of his horse striking the packed earth of the road, the sound fading into the vast and silent dark. There is a sound that the steppe makes that is unlike any other sound in the world. It is not quite wind and not quite silence, but something between them, a presence, a resonance, a humming that comes from the grass and the space, and the movement of air over an unobstructed plain so enormous that sound itself seems to behave differently out there. The Mongols heard this sound every day of their lives. It was the background of everything, of work and play and sleep and prayer and war. It was in a sense the voice of their world, the voice of the land that had made them. When Genghis Khan prayed, and the secret history suggests he prayed regularly, climbing mountains alone to commune with Tengri, he heard this sound. When the great Kurultai assembled on the banks of the Onon, this sound moved through the assembled thousands like a breath. When the armies formed up and began to move, the sound changed, mixed with the percussion of hooves and the flutter of standards and the creak of leather and wood. But underneath it all the steppe was still speaking, still humming its ancient wordless note. You cannot hear it from here. It is too far away, and the world between here and there is too full of other sounds. But on a night like this, in the quiet, if you close your eyes and breathe slowly and let the thoughts settle like snow, you can almost feel the shape of that sound, the open space of it, the patience of it, the way it asks nothing of you but to be still for a moment, The steppe is very far away and very close. Let the sound come if it wants to. Let your breathing slow to match it. And let the vast, ancient, complicated, beautiful story of the people who live there carry you gently, gently into the long rest of the night. There is a question that historians have been asking about Genghis Khan for as long as there have been historians to ask it. Was he great? The question seems almost absurd in some ways. He built the largest land empire in history. He transformed the political and cultural landscape of Eurasia in ways that are still visible today. By any measure of historical impact, he was one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived. But great is not a synonym for consequential. Greatness, in the full ethical sense, implies something positive about the achievement, implies that the world was made better, that human flourishing was advanced, that the ledger of gains exceeds the ledger of losses, and the ledger here is complicated. The organizational innovations are genuine achievements. The religious tolerance is genuinely admirable. The Pax Mongolica and its role in connecting civilizations is real and important. The meritocratic principles are genuinely progressive for their era. Against these, the millions dead, the cities in ashes, the destroyed irrigation systems, the civilizations permanently set back or eliminated. Is this greatness? Or is it something more ambiguous? Something that deserves to be studied and understood without being celebrated, admired in its architecture without endorsing its cost? Each person who sits with this story must find their own answer. The historian's role is not to resolve the question, but to make sure all the evidence is on the table, the achievements and the atrocities both, so that the resolution, when it comes, is informed rather than lazy. Tonight, on the steppe, in the quiet, with the fire very low and the stars very bright, we can hold the question without needing to answer it. We can let it sit with us as we drift towards sleep as part of the enormous, complicated, beautiful, terrible human story that is history's greatest gift to those willing to listen. And so we have travelled together, you and I, across the vast geography of one man's extraordinary life and the empire his life produced. We began at the river, the Onon, cold and clear in the Mongolian night. We watched a boy born gripping something in his fist, into a world that would take everything from him almost immediately. We watched him endure the death of his father, the abandonment of his clan, the humiliation of the wooden collar, the cold of the river where he hid. We watched him begin to build, alliance by alliance, loyalty by loyalty, one trusted companion at a time, the slow and careful construction of something unprecedented. We followed him through the decades of unification, through the rivalries and betrayals, through Jamukha's shadow, through the wars against the Tatars and the Karaites and the Naimans, to that moment on the banks of his childhood river when the great white banner was raised, and the assembled peoples gave him a name as vast as the sky overhead. We watched him build the machine of war, the decimal system, the composite bow, the feigned retreat, the intelligence networks, the speed and the silence and the terrible precision. We watched the campaigns unfold across the world, south into China, west into Khwarazm, further west still as his generals followed their orders to the ends of the earth. And we watched him die, somewhere near the Yellow River, old and worn, and having seen everything, returning to the mountain where he had prayed as a frightened boy. We explored the daily life of the empire, the years and the fires, the Erag and the long winter stories, the women who held everything together, the artisans and the merchants and the scholars. We sat with the complexity of the legacy, the Pax Mongolica's trading roads and the ruins of burned cities, the religious tolerance and the systematic massacres, the organizational genius and the catastrophic human cost. And we let the stories continue, late into the night, Subutai the arrow's journey to the ends of the earth, Sorkaktani's quiet genius, the fountain of wine in Karakoram, the nurge that trained an army while hunting, the yam that made an empire breathe. What remains as the night finally deepens toward its still center? Perhaps only this, that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, of extraordinary creation and extraordinary destruction, often simultaneously, often inseparably. That the history of the world is not the history of simple heroes and simple villains, but the history of complex people operating under complex pressures, making choices whose consequences ripple outward across centuries in ways they could not have anticipated. Genghis Khan was not a saint. He was not a monster. He was a man of ferocious intelligence and will and vision and capability, shaped by a brutal world into something that both reflected and transcended that world. A man who looked at the fractured, feuding steppe and saw somehow the outline of an order that could be imposed on it. A man who had the patience and the ruthlessness and the organizational brilliance to impose that order at a cost that is still being assessed. He lies somewhere in the Mongolian earth tonight. The grass grows over him, the horses graze above him, the stars, his Tengri, his eternal father, wheel in the darkness overhead, the same stars that watched him hid in the reeds with a collar around his neck, the same stars that watched him raise the white banner, the same stars that watched the last embers of the Khwarezmian Empire die and the roads of the world open for one brief century to anyone brave enough to walk them. The steppe is quiet. The wind moves through the grass with a sound like the turning of pages in a very old book. The fire is very low, just coals now, just warmth, just light enough to see by. The story is done. And you are here, comfortable and still in the quiet of your own night, having travelled to the other end of the world and back, having held in your mind for a while the vast and complicated and deeply human story of how one man changed everything. Let it settle now. Let the details drift and blur, as they do in the space between waking and sleeping, not gone, but softened, becoming part of the texture of your rest rather than the sharp edge of waking thought. The steppe is inside you now a little. The horses graze in the quiet chambers of your memory. The stars turn very slowly. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you should be. This has been the Hypnotic Historian, and tonight we walked the Mongolian steppe together. If this hour, these hours, helped you find the rest you were looking for, I hope you'll stay with us. There are so many more stories in the long, quiet library of human history, so many more fires to sit beside, so many more nights of slow and gentle storytelling waiting on the other side of sleep. Subscribe if you'd like to come back, share us with someone who needs a quiet night, and know that whenever the hour is late and the mind is restless, this channel will be here, with the fire lit and the story ready and all the long calm hours of history waiting to carry you gently into rest. Sleep well. The steppe is peaceful tonight. The horses breathe. The stars are keeping watch. And you can let go now of everything. Let the darkness come in. It is safe. It is warm. It is very, very quiet. Good night.